There are wounds that don't bleed. There are victories no one cheers for. And there are women whom God grants the heart of a warrior when they need it most. I am one of them. The thin light of dawn crept through the cabin window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Abigail Hayes placed a protective hand over the swell of her belly as she eased herself up from the rocking chair. 7 months along now, the child within her stirred a gentle flutter against her palm. A boy, she thought, strong like his father. Matthew's journal lay open on her lap, the pages worn from repeated reading. His handwriting, slanted and precise, had become both comfort and torment. 6 months since they'd laid him in the ground behind the barn. 6 months of talking to a ghost. Another day, little one, she whispered to her unborn child. Another day closer to meeting you. The mirror above the wash basin reflected a woman Abigail sometimes barely recognized. 29 years old, her face had grown leaner since Matthew's passing, cheekbones more pronounced beneath eyes that had witnessed too much sorrow. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical braid, a few stubborn strands framing her face. The blue calico dress, let out to accommodate her growing belly, had seen better days. She'd been beautiful once or so, Matthew had told her. Back in the war when she'd been a nurse tending to broken men in field hospitals. Back when the blood on her hands wasn't her husband's. The cabin creaked and settled in the morning chill. 2 chairs on the porch that nobody sat in, a roof that groaned with every strong wind, a home that was half empty. This wasn't the life they'd planned when they'd come west to Arizona territory after the war. Matthew with his dreams of building something lasting, Abigail with her medical bag and hope for peace after too many years of mending shattered bodies. Now there was just the small ranch outside Tombstone, the few cattle, the vegetable garden, and the child that would never know its father. Abigail moved to the stove, methodically building a fire. Her hands knew the work even as her mind wandered. She'd light the stove, make coffee, check the garden, mend the chicken coop, all while carrying Matthew's child in his memory, all while wondering if she was strong enough for what lay ahead. You are, she could almost hear Matthew say, you're the strongest person I know, Abby. But he'd been wrong about that. She hadn't been strong enough to save him. The coffee was just beginning to boil when the first knock came at the door. Martha Carson stood on the porch, a basket over one arm. At 68, Martha was spare as a winter tree, all angles and weathered skin, but her eyes remained sharp as a hawk's. Brought you some sourdough and preserves, Martha said, bustling past Abigail into the cabin. You're looking peaked, not sleeping again. Martha was the closest thing to family Abigail had out here. The older woman had lost her husband to Apache raiders 15 years back, her daughter to childbirth fever not long after. She'd survived it all and somehow kept her kindness intact, though it came wrapped in practicality as tough as old leather. The baby's restless at night, Abigail said, accepting the basket. It wasn't entirely a lie. The baby did kick and turn in the dark hours, but it was the dreams that kept her from sleep. Dreams of Matthew bleeding out in her arms, whispering words she couldn't quite hear. Martha's gaze was knowing. Well, that child's got Hayes blood. Your Matthew never could sit still, even as a man grown. She placed a gnarled hand on Abigail's belly, smiling when she felt movement. Strong one. You decided on names yet? Matthew, if it's a boy, Abigail said softly. For a girl, I'm not certain. You'll know when you see her, Martha said, confidence in every syllable. Now let me show you how to make a tincture for those swollen ankles. Can't have you hobbling around like an old woman when there's work to be done. The morning passed in Martha's company, the older woman demonstrating how to mix herbs for various remedies, supplementing Abigail's formal medical training with frontier wisdom passed down through generations. It was a good morning, one of the better ones since Matthew's death, and for a few hours, Abigail felt almost normal. After Martha left, promising to return in a few days with more supplies from town, Abigail made her way to the garden. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly, but the vegetables needed tending. She'd just begun harvesting the ripe tomatoes when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the buzzing of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. A whimper. Human. Coming from the direction of the barn. Abigail straightened, one hand instinctively moving to her belly, the other reaching for the small revolver she kept in her apron pocket. Matthew's revolver, the one that hadn't saved him. Hello, she called, her voice steady despite the sudden race of her heart. Is someone there? Silence answered her. Then so quiet she might have imagined it another whimper. Abigail moved toward the barn, careful to stay aware of her surroundings. The war and frontier life had taught her caution. The weight of the child within her made her doubly vigilant. The barn door stood partially open, though she was certain she'd latched it that morning. Shadows pooled in the corners of the building, the smell of hay and horse strong in the still air. Abigail's eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness after the bright sunlight outside. "I'm armed," she called. "Show yourself." Nothing moved. Then her gaze caught on something hanging from one of the crossbeams. A burlap sack swinging slightly in a breeze she couldn't feel. Too still. Too heavy. Abigail approached cautiously, the revolver steady in her hand. The sack was suspended by a length of frayed rope, not tied properly but caught on a splintered edge of wood. As she drew closer, she saw dark stains at the bottom of the sack. Blood, old and new. Her nurse's instincts took over. She holstered the revolver and reached for her pocket knife, carefully cutting the rope. The sack fell to the hay-strewn floor with a soft thud and a muffled cry of pain. Abigail knelt as quickly as her condition allowed, pulling open the mouth of the sack. Inside was a young woman, perhaps 23 or 24, her face bruised almost beyond recognition. Her dress was torn, her skin dry and blistered lips cracked and bleeding. One wrist remained bound with rusted wire that had cut deep into the flesh. The woman's eyes fluttered open, hazel filled with terror, and fixed on Abigail. She didn't scream or beg. She just whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Just kill me fast." Abigail felt a chill run through her, despite the summer heat. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice calm, the same tone she'd used with wounded soldiers, it's delirious with pain and fear. "I'm Abigail Hayes. This is my ranch. I was a nurse in the war. I can help you." The woman's gaze darted around frantically as if expecting others to appear. Her breathing came in shallow, panicked gasps. "You're safe here," Abigail continued, reaching slowly to examine the wire around the woman's wrist. "I'm going to cut this off, and then we'll get you inside. Can you tell me your name?" The woman flinched at Abigail's touch but didn't pull away. Her lips moved but no sound emerged. She tried again, a single word escaping: "Water." "Of course." Abigail carefully cut through the wire, wincing at the infected wounds beneath. "Let's get you inside first." "Can you walk?" The woman tried to rise but collapsed almost immediately. Abigail caught her, the awkward angle sending a twinge of pain through her lower back. For a moment they stayed like that, two women clinging to each other in a dimly lit barn, one heavily pregnant, one barely clinging to life. "I've got you," Abigail murmured. "Lean on me." Small steps. It took nearly 20 minutes to make the short journey from barn to cabin, the woman stumbling beside Abigail, stopping frequently to rest. By the time they reached the porch, Abigail's dress was soaked with sweat, and the woman was barely conscious. Inside, Abigail helped her onto the bed, Matthew's side untouched since his death, and hurried to fetch water. The woman drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and neck before falling back against the pillows, exhausted. Abigail worked methodically, cleaning the worst of the wounds, particularly the deep cuts where the wire had bit into flesh. The woman didn't speak, didn't cry out, but tears streamed silently down her face as Abigail tended to her injuries. It was when Abigail began cleaning a particularly nasty gash on the woman's arm that she noticed it. A silver bracelet, tarnished and bent, but unmistakable. A delicate chain with a small heart charm. Abigail's hands froze. She knew this bracelet, had helped pick it out in a shop in St. Louis years ago. It was the gift Matthew had given to his younger sister before she'd gone missing on her way west to join them. A sister they'd never found despite months of searching. "Where did you get this?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes had closed, her breathing becoming more regular as exhaustion claimed her. She didn't respond. Abigail continued her examination, her mind racing. The coincidence was too great. As she worked her way down to the woman's wrists, again planning to apply salve to the wire cuts, she noticed something else. On the inside of the right wrist, partially obscured by dirt and dried blood, was a crude tattoo. 3 letters not professionally done, but burned into the skin: JKS. The room seemed to tilt around Abigail. Those same 3 letters had been found carved into Matthew's chest when they discovered his body after the bank robbery. The sheriff had mentioned seeing similar markings on other victims in the territory: JKS. No one knew what it meant. Abigail sat heavily in the chair beside the bed, one hand protectively covering her belly as the child within kicked vigorously as if sensing her distress. "Who are you?" she whispered to the sleeping woman. "And what does JKS want with you? With us?" The woman slept on, oblivious to the questions swirling in Abigail's mind. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Abigail rose to light the lamps and close the shutters, casting frequent glances at her unexpected guest. Whatever had brought this woman to her door, whatever connection she might have to Matthew and his death, Abigail knew one thing with certainty: nothing would be the same after today. For 3 days, the woman drifted between consciousness and fevered sleep. Abigail barely left her side, applying cool compresses to her forehead, changing bandages, coaxing water and broth between cracked lips. Her medical training served her well, but it was the memories of battlefield hospitals that truly prepared her for the fight to save this stranger's life. On the fourth morning, Abigail woke in the rocking chair beside the bed to find the woman watching her with clear, wary eyes. "You're pregnant," the woman said, her voice still rough but stronger. Abigail nodded, one hand automatically moving to her belly. 7 months. The woman's gaze flickered around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the medical supplies on the table, the men's coat hanging by the door. "Your husband, dead," Abigail said simply. 6 months ago." Something shifted in the woman's expression, recognition perhaps, or understanding. She closed her eyes briefly before asking, "Why are you helping me?" "Because you needed help," Abigail replied. It was the truth, if not the whole truth. She wasn't ready to ask about the bracelet or the tattoo, not yet. "Can you tell me your name?" The woman hesitated, then whispered, "Clara. Clara Bishop." "Where are you from, Clara?" "Denver." Clara's hand moved to touch the bracelet, a gesture that seemed unconscious. "My father was a minister there." Was, past tense. Abigail noted the small details, the things people said without realizing. "How did you end up in a sack in my barn?" Clara flinched, her gaze darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. "They'll come looking for me," she said, voice dropping to a whisper. "If they find out I'm alive, they'll come." "Who?" Abigail pressed gently. "JKS." Clara's fingers traced the crude tattoo on her wrist. "They mark their property." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Abigail had heard rumors of women disappearing along the frontier of trafficking rings, operating in the territories where law was thin and distances great. "How long were you with them?" Abigail asked, keeping her voice neutral, the way she'd learned to do when treating soldiers with particularly horrific wounds. "I don't know. Months, maybe a year." Clara's gaze grew distant. "They took me when the stagecoach stopped for water. Said they were lawmen. Had badges. I believed them." A bitter laugh escaped her. Minister's daughter. So trusting. Abigail reached for the pot of willowbark tea she'd prepared earlier. "This will help with the pain," she said, pouring a cup and helping Clara sit up to drink it. "You're safe here, Clara. I won't let them take you again." Clara's eyes met hers, disbelief clear in their depths. "You don't know what they're capable of." "I've seen what men can do to each other," Abigail said quietly. "I was a nurse during the war. Not much surprises me anymore." Clara studied her for a long moment before asking, "What happened to your husband?" The question hit Abigail like a physical blow. She hadn't spoken of Matthew's death to anyone except the sheriff and Martha. "Bank robbery," she said finally. "He was a teller. Wrong place, wrong time." It was the official story, the one everyone in town believed, but the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. Clara nodded slowly, something unreadable passing across her face. "I'm sorry," she said, and the simple words carried a weight that suggested she understood loss intimately. "Rest now," Abigail said, rising to her feet. "I need to tend to the animals and garden. I'll be close by if you need anything." As she reached the door, Clara called out, "Mrs. Hayes." Abigail turned. "Abigail, please." "Abigail." Clara swallowed hard. "Thank you for not touching me the way they did." The words hung in the air, a testament to horrors Abigail could only imagine. "Some wounds don't show on the outside," she said softly. "I learned in the war that sometimes silence heals better than words." Clara nodded, tears filling her eyes before she turned her face to the wall. Abigail slipped outside, closing the door gently behind her. In the yard, she paused, one hand braced against the porch post as she fought back her own tears. The bracelet, the tattoo, the timing of it all. These couldn't be coincidences. Somehow this woman was connected to Matthew's death, to his sister's disappearance, to whatever JKS was, and Abigail was determined to find out how. The days fell into a tentative rhythm. Clara grew stronger physically, though she remained haunted, flinching at sudden movements, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. She slept on the floor beside the stove, refusing the comfort of the bed despite Abigail's protests. "Can't sleep on something soft anymore," she explained simply. "Feels wrong." Abigail understood. She'd seen similar behaviors in soldiers returning from the front. Men who couldn't sleep in beds after years on hard ground, who startled at loud noises, who watched doorways and windows with wary eyes. She didn't press Clara for more information about JKS or how she'd ended up in the barn. Instead, Abigail talked while she worked, about the garden, the coming winter, the preparations for the baby. Neutral topics that required no response but filled the silence. On the seventh day, Clara followed her outside to the garden. She stood uncertainly in the doorway, squinting in the bright sunlight before taking hesitant steps into the yard. "Would you like to help?" Abigail asked, not looking up from the tomato plants she was tending. "There's another basket by the porch." Clara nodded, retrieving the basket and kneeling awkwardly beside Abigail. Her hands, still healing from the wire cuts, moved clumsily among the plants. "My mother had a garden," she said unexpectedly, "in Denver. Roses and vegetables together. Father said it was impractical, but she insisted beauty and sustenance could grow side by side." It was the most Clara had spoken at one time since her arrival. Abigail smiled, encouraged. "She sounds wise, your mother." "She died when I was 16. Influenza." Clara's fingers gently cradled a ripe tomato before picking it. "That's when Father decided to send me to my aunt in San Francisco. The stagecoach never made it." Abigail's heart ached for the young woman. "How long ago was that? 2 years, maybe more?" Clara's voice was distant. Days and nights blurred together after a while. 2 years. Matthew's sister had disappeared almost 3 years ago. Not the same person then, but the bracelet. "That's a lovely bracelet," Abigail said carefully, nodding toward the silver chain on Clara's wrist. "Was it your mother's?" Clara touched it protectively. "No, it was given to me by someone who tried to help us. He said it belonged to his sister, that I reminded him of her." Abigail's hands stilled among the plants. "This man, did he tell you his name?" Clara's gaze snapped to Abigail's face, suddenly wary. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Abigail said, striving to keep her voice casual despite the hammering of her heart. Clara studied her for a long moment before answering. "Matthew. His name was Matthew." The world seemed to stop around Abigail. The buzzing of insects, the distant call of birds, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, all faded to nothing as those words echoed in her mind. "Matthew," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara's expression shifted from wariness to dawning realization. "Hayes," she said. "Matthew Hayes, that was his full name. He said he had a wife named Abigail." Her eyes widened. "You're her. You're his Abigail." Abigail nodded, unable to form words as emotion closed her throat. "He talked about you," Clara continued, words tumbling out now. "Said you were a nurse in the war, that you were the strongest person he knew, that he was going to bring you all the girls he could save." Her face crumpled. "He died trying to save us. They killed him because he knew too much." Bank robbery. Abigail managed the official story, suddenly hollow in the face of this revelation. Clara shook her head vehemently. "No, that was just how they made it look. He wasn't even supposed to be working that day. They knew he was gathering evidence against them. They made an example of him." Abigail felt as though the ground had opened beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about Matthew's death, about their life together, was shifting like sand. "Evidence of what?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "What was Matthew involved in?" Clara glanced around the open yard nervously. "Not here," she whispered. "Inside." They abandoned the garden, Abigail helping Clara to her feet, both women moving with urgency back to the cabin. Once inside, Clara sank onto a chair, her brief burst of energy fading. "Matthew was working with someone," she said, voice low. "A lawman, I think. He'd been gathering information on JKS for months. Names, locations, records of girls taken and sold." "JKS," Abigail repeated. "What does it stand for?" "Justice Killers Syndicate." Clara replied, bitterness edging her words. That's what they called themselves. Said they were bringing justice to the territories by deciding who deserved to live freely and who deserved to be property. Abigail felt sick, and Matthew was investigating them. Why? How did he even know about them? Clara's fingers traced the outline of the bracelet. His sister, she said softly. She disappeared on her way to join you here. He never stopped looking for her. Somehow he connected her disappearance to other missing women and started piecing it together. Matthew's sister, Emma. They'd waited months for her arrival, sending telegrams, checking with stagecoach companies, even hiring a Pinkerton detective briefly. Eventually, they had been forced to accept that she was likely dead, another victim of the dangers of travel in the territories. But Matthew had never truly accepted it, Abigail realized. He'd continued searching in secret, all while maintaining their normal life. He never told me, she whispered, a mixture of hurt and confusion washing over her. He wanted to protect you, Clara said. Said if anything happened to him, you'd be safer not knowing. A bitter laugh escaped Abigail. And how did that work out for him? Clara flinched and Abigail immediately regretted her harsh tone. I'm sorry, she said. It's just, all this time I thought I knew him. We shared everything, or so I believed. He loved you, Clara said simply. Everything he did was to make the world safer for you and your child. He talked about you constantly, how you'd be a wonderful mother, how he couldn't wait to see you hold your baby. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. She brushed them away impatiently. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning, how you met Matthew, what he was investigating, everything you know about JKS. Clara took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. It started when they brought me to a place they called The Holding. A ranch about 2 days' ride from here, hidden in a box canyon. There were other girls there, maybe 15 of us. As Clara spoke, the full horror of JKS's operation unfolded. Young women disappeared from stagecoaches, remote homesteads, even small towns. They were broken through beatings, starvation, and, worse, than sold to wealthy buyers across the territories and beyond. Some went to mining camps or cattle towns. Others to private homes of powerful men. A few, the especially beautiful or educated, were shipped to San Francisco or even overseas. Matthew had discovered the operation while searching for his sister. He had posed as a bank clerk interested in investing in their business ventures, slowly gaining their trust while documenting everything he learned. He helped 3 girls escape before me, Clara said. Gave me this bracelet for luck, said he'd come back for me next. But they found out somehow. Set a trap. The bank, Abigail murmured, pieces falling into place. Clara nodded. They knew he'd be there that day. Made it look like a robbery gone wrong. But the marks they left on him, the JKS, that was a message to anyone else who might interfere. Abigail closed her eyes, remembering the sheriff's description of Matthew's body, the details he'd tried to spare her, but that she'd insisted on knowing. The carved letters, the deliberate ritualistic nature of the wounds. How did you escape? She asked, opening her eyes again. Clara's expression darkened. I didn't, not really. After Matthew died, they became more careful, moved locations, increased security, but they also got sloppy with the girls they considered damaged goods. The ones too rebellious or too broken to pell well. Her voice dropped. They decided to make an example of me too. Left me in that sack to die slowly. A warning to the others. But someone cut you down, Abigail said. Left you in my barn specifically. Why bohagamai? I don't know, Clara admitted. I was barely conscious. I remember being moved voices, arguing, then nothing, until I woke up with you cutting me free. Abigail frowned, considering this new information. Someone knows about Matthew's connection to this place. Someone who either wants to help or wants me involved for some reason. It's not safe for you, Clara said, urgently. If they find out I'm alive, if they suspect you know anything about their operation. I'm already involved, Abigail interrupted, one hand resting on her belly. They made me involved when they killed my husband, when they took his sister, when they left you in my barn. Clara looked at her with a mixture of admiration and fear. What are you going to do? Before Abigail could answer, the sound of hoofbeats approached the cabin. Both women tensed, Clara shrinking back toward the shadows of the kitchen area. Abigail moved to the window, carefully peering out through a gap in the curtains. A single rider approached, the glint of a star on his chest visible even from a distance. "It's the sheriff," she said, both relieved and suddenly wary in light of Clara's revelations. "Stay out of sight." Clara nodded, fear plain on her face as she retreated to the bedroom. Abigail smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door just as Sheriff Nathaniel Cooper was about to knock. "Mrs. Hayes," he greeted, removing his hat. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." Nathaniel Cooper had been Matthew's friend, or so Abigail had believed. A tall man in his mid-40s with graying temples and a weathered face, he'd been one of the few to offer genuine support after Matthew's death. "Not at all, Sheriff," she replied, forcing a smile. "What brings you out this way?" "Just checking in," he said, eyes sweeping over the property in a way that suddenly seemed less friendly and more assessing. "Martha mentioned she was worried about you out here alone in your condition." "I'm managing fine," Abigail said, remaining in the doorway rather than inviting him in as she normally would have. "The baby's not due for another 2 months." Cooper nodded, his gaze lingering on the garden with its abandoned baskets. "Been hearing reports of strangers in the area," he said casually. "Thought I should let you know. Keep your doors locked at night." "What kind of strangers?" Abigail asked, careful to keep her voice merely curious. "Hard to say. Drifters maybe, or worse." Cooper's eyes came back to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "You haven't noticed anything unusual, have you? Anyone hanging around the property?" Abigail thought of Clara, hidden in the bedroom of the sack in the barn, of the revelations about Matthew. She maintained her neutral expression with effort. "Nothing unusual," she lied. "But I appreciate the warning." Cooper seemed about to say something else when his attention was caught by something near the porch steps. He dismounted in one fluid motion, crouching to examine the ground. "That's odd," he murmured. "What is it?" Abigail asked, her heart rate increasing. Cooper stood brushing dirt from his fingers. "Boot prints. Not yours, I'd wager, unless you've taken to wearing men's sizes lately." His attempt at humor fell flat as his eyes scanned the yard again, more deliberately this time. "You sure you haven't had visitors, Mrs. Hayes?" Abigail's mind raced. "Martha was here a few days ago," she said, "and Dr. Wilson stopped by to check on the baby last week." Cooper nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, if you do see anything concerning, you send word to town immediately. Don't try to handle trouble yourself." His gaze dropped to her belly meaningfully. "You've got more than just yourself to think about now." "Of course," Abigail agreed. "Was there anything else, Sheriff?" Cooper settled his hat back on his head. "Actually, there was. Been meaning to ask if Matthew left any papers behind. Journals, letters, that sort of thing." The question sent a chill through Abigail. "Why do you ask?" "Just tying up loose ends from the robbery," Cooper said smoothly. "Never did recover all the bank's documentation. Thought Matthew might have brought work home sometimes." Matthew's journal, the one she read from every night. Did it contain information about JKS? Had she been holding evidence all this time without realizing it? "I haven't come across anything like that," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "But I'll look through his things and let you know if I find anything relevant." "I'd appreciate that." Cooper's smile didn't reach his eyes. He mounted his horse in one practiced movement. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Hayes. These are dangerous times." Abigail watched him ride away, remaining on the porch until he disappeared from view. Only then did she allow her shoulders to slump, her hand trembling slightly as she pushed a strand of hair from her face. Clara emerged from the bedroom, her face pale. "You can't trust him," she whispered urgently. "Sheriff or not, you can't trust anyone." "I know," Abigail said, the weight of that knowledge settling heavily upon her. She moved to the shelf where Matthew's journal lay and picked it up with new purpose. "Let's see what my husband was really doing before he died." As evening settled over the ranch, Abigail and Clara sat at the kitchen table, Matthew's journal open between them, along with several folded papers that had been hidden in the binding. "He was meticulous," Abigail murmured, running her finger down a list of names and dates. "All these women, so many." "He documented everything," Clara confirmed. "Descriptions of the girls, where they were taken from, where they were sent, if he knew." The journal contained far more than Abigail had realized. What she thought were mundane entries about banking and daily life were actually coded references to JKS operations. Matthew had developed a simple cipher, replacing keywords with innocuous banking terms. Deposits were new girls brought in. Withdrawals were those sold or removed. Accounts were the men who bought them. Most disturbing were the names of respected citizens among the buyers and facilitators, wealthy ranchers, businessmen, even a judge in Prescott. And Cooper, Abigail asked, dreading the answer, is he mentioned? Clara hesitated. Not by name, but Matthew refers several times to the badge, someone in law enforcement who was helping him gather evidence. Could be Cooper, Abigail said thoughtfully, or another lawman entirely. Either way, he was asking about these papers specifically, Clara pointed out. And if he's truly Matthew's ally, why wait 6 months to come looking for them? Abigail had no answer for that. Instead, she turned to a rough map Matthew had drawn showing the location of what Clara had called the holding. You said they moved after Matthew died. Clara nodded. To somewhere more remote. I wasn't fully conscious during the move, but I remember water, the sound of a river or creek nearby. There aren't many year-round water sources in this region, Abigail mused. Narrows down the possibilities. She traced the outline of the territory on the map, her nurse's mind cataloging details with clinical precision. If JKS had a new holding facility, it would need to be isolated yet accessible for bringing girls in and out. It would need water shelter and enough space to house multiple captives. What are you thinking? Clara asked, watching Abigail's face closely. I'm thinking we need more information, Abigail replied, and I know how to get it. Clara's expression grew alarmed. You can't go into town. It's too dangerous, especially in your condition. Not towns, Abigail said, closing the journal and gathering the papers. Martha Carson. If anyone knows the hidden places in this territory, it's her. And she's the only person I trust completely right now. And if she betrays that trust, Abigail met Clara's gaze steadily, then we'll have learned something important, won't we? She moved to the fireplace, lifting a loose brick to reveal a small cavity beneath. Carefully, she placed the journal and papers inside. We'll go tomorrow, she decided. Martha's ranch is half a day's ride from here. We'll bring the wagon, easier for you to travel in and less suspicious than 2 women on horseback. Clara looked uncertain. Are you sure about this? About me going with you? I'm not leaving you alone here, Abigail said firmly. Not with Cooper or whoever left you in my barn, possibly watching the place. The child within her kicked vigorously as if emphasizing her point. Abigail placed a hand on her belly, a gesture that had become automatic. He agrees, she said with a small smile. Clara's expression softened. How do you know it's a boy? Just a feeling, Abigail admitted. Matthew was convinced it would be a girl. Said she'd have my stubbornness and his charm. A dangerous combination, Clara said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Both women glanced toward the windows, tension returning to their postures. We should get some rest, Abigail said, moving to check that the doors and windows were securely latched. Tomorrow will be a long day. Clara nodded, already arranging her makeshift bed by the stove. Abigail, she said softly as the older woman turned to leave. Thank you for believing me about Matthew, for helping me. Abigail paused in the doorway to her bedroom. He believed in you enough to risk his life, she said simply. That's good enough for me. As she prepared for bed, Abigail found herself talking softly to her unborn child, a habit she'd developed in the lonely months since Matthew's death. Your father was a brave man, she whispered, her hand tracing circles on her belly. Braver than I knew. And I promise you this, I will find the people who took him from us. I will finish what he started. And somehow I will make this world safer for you to grow up in. The baby shifted within her, a reassuring presence in the gathering darkness. Abigail closed her eyes, drawing strength from that small life, even as her mind raced with plans and possibilities. Tomorrow they would seek answers from Martha. Tomorrow they would take the first step toward justice for Matthew and all the women JKS had victimized. Tomorrow, Abigail Hayes would begin to truly understand the man she had married and the woman she needed to become to honor his memory. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Abigail had been awake for hours, packing supplies and preparing the wagon for the journey to Martha's ranch. Clara helped as much as her still healing body allowed her movements, becoming steadier with each passing day. We should reach Martha's by mid-afternoon if we leave now, Abigail said, securing the last of their provisions. The trail's relatively easy, follows a creek most of the way. Clara nodded, her gaze continually scanning their surroundings, a habit born of constant vigilance during her captivity. What if someone sees us on the road? We're just two women visiting a neighbor, Abigail replied, checking the revolver before tucking it into the pocket of her coat. Nothing unusual about that. She helped Clara onto the wagon seat before climbing up awkwardly beside her, her pregnant belly making the simple action more difficult than it once would have been. The horse, an aging but reliable gelding named Samson, waited patiently in the traces. As Abigail gathered the reins, a flash of movement near the barn caught her attention. She stilled, eyes narrowing as she scanned the structure. "What is it?" Clara asked, tension evident in her voice. "Not sure," Abigail murmured, reaching slowly for the revolver. "Thought I saw something by the barn." The morning air hung still and cold around them. Nothing moved. After a long moment, a jackrabbit darted from behind the barn, pausing briefly before disappearing into the scrub beyond. Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Just a rabbit," she said, though the unease lingered. "Let's go." She flicked the reins, and Samson began plodding forward, pulling the wagon down the rutted drive toward the main trail. Neither woman spoke as the ranch receded behind them, both lost in their own thoughts. The territory stretched around them, vast and deceptively empty. Scrub and cactus dotted the landscape, with occasional stands of cottonwood marking the presence of water beneath the surface. In the distance, mountains rose purple against the sky, their peaks still bearing traces of last winter's snow. It was beautiful in its harsh way, this land Matthew had brought her to after the war. So different from the green hills of Pennsylvania, where she'd grown up, from the blood-soaked fields of Virginia, where she'd tended the wounded and dying. "I never understood why he wanted to come west," Abigail said, after they had been traveling for an hour, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Matthew. He had offers from banks in St. Louis, Chicago, places with proper society, theaters, schools, but he insisted Arizona was where we should build our future." Clara glanced at her. "Did he say why?" "Said he wanted open skies." Abigail replied, a sad smile touching her lips. "Room to breathe after the war. I thought it was just that, the need to escape the memories of what we'd both seen back east." "And now," Clara asked gently, "now I wonder if he already knew about the trafficking even then. If he chose Arizona because of Emma's disappearance." Abigail sighed, adjusting her position on the hard seat to ease the ache in her lower back. "So many secrets. Men often think they're protecting us by keeping secrets." Clara said, her voice holding a wisdom beyond her years. "My father was the same way, always shielding me from the harsh realities of the world." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Fat lot of good that did when reality came calling, anyway." They fell silent again as the wagon crested a small rise. Below, a creek cut through the landscape, a thin ribbon of silver flanked by greener vegetation. Abigail guided Samson toward it, planning to stop and rest both the horse and themselves. As they approached the water, Clara suddenly gripped Abigail's arm. "Someone's been here," she whispered, pointing to the ground near the creek bank. Abigail saw it immediately, the remains of a small fire recently doused but still damp. Beside it, hoof prints and boot marks showed where riders had stopped to rest. "Could be anyone," Abigail said, though her hand moved to the revolver in her pocket. "Travelers, cowboys moving cattle." "Or JKS," Clara said, her voice tight with fear. "They patrol these trails, looking for women traveling alone." Abigail surveyed the area carefully before making a decision. "We'll stop briefly," she said. "Samson needs water and so do we, but we'll be quick about it." She guided the wagon to a spot upstream from the fire remains, helping Clara down before unhitching Samson to let him drink. The creek burbled softly over smooth stones, the sound normally soothing, but now seeming to mask potential approaching hoofbeats. Abigail filled their canteens while Clara stretched her legs, both women remaining alert to their surroundings. The sun had risen higher, warming the chill from the air, but neither could fully relax. "We should move on," Abigail said after Samson had drunk his fill. "Martha's place is still a few hours away." As she turned to guide the horse back to the wagon, a sound froze her in place, the distinctive click of a rifle hammer being cocked. "Don't move," a man's voice called from the brush above the creek. "Hands where I can see them." Abigail slowly raised her hands, positioning herself between Clara and the unseen gunman. "We're just passing through," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "We mean no harm." "Turn around," the voice commanded. "Slow." Abigail complied, keeping her movements deliberate, her mind racing to formulate a plan. The revolver was still in her pocket, but she'd never reach it in time if the man decided to shoot. From the brush emerged a figure, not the hardened criminal she'd expected, but a boy, perhaps 16 or 17, holding a rifle that seemed too large for his frame. His clothes were dusty, his face sunburned and wary beneath a shock of sandy hair. "You're just a child," Abigail said, surprise momentarily overriding caution. The boy's face hardened. "I'm old enough to pull this trigger, ma'am, so I suggest you don't try anything." "We're not looking for trouble," Abigail said, keeping her voice calm. "My name is Abigail Hayes. This is my friend Clara. We're on our way to visit Martha Carson." Something flickered in the boy's eyes at the mention of Martha's name. He lowered the rifle slightly. "Mrs. Carson, the widow from up by Devil's Creek." Abigail nodded, hope rising. "You know her." "Everybody knows Mrs. Carson," the boy said, though he didn't fully lower his weapon. "She helped my ma birth my little sisters last winter." "And then you know she's a good woman," Abigail pressed. "A friend. We're just going to visit her, that's all." The boy seemed to struggle with indecision before finally lowering the rifle completely. "Sorry for the scare, ma'am. Can't be too careful these days. There's been men watching the trails, taking folks who look like easy targets." Abigail exchanged a glance with Clara, whose face had gone pale. "What kind of men?" Abigail asked carefully. "Don't rightly know," the boy admitted. "Pa said they dress like regular cowboys, but they ain't looking for cattle. They're looking for people, women mostly." He shifted uncomfortably. "That's why I'm out here. Pa sent me to escort my sister to town, but she's running late." Abigail's maternal instincts stirred. "How old is your sister?" 15, the boy replied. "She's been helping at the Johnson's place this past week. Their baby came early." Clara stepped forward, speaking for the first time since the boy had appeared. "You should go to her," she said urgently. "Don't wait here. Find her and bring her home another way, not along the main trail." The boy blinked, startled by the intensity in Clara's voice. "The Johnson's place is just over that rise," he said, gesturing vaguely. "She's probably already on her way." "Then meet her halfway," Abigail suggested, understanding Clara's fear. "Better safe than sorry." The boy considered this, then nodded. "Reckon you're right." He hesitated. "You ladies be careful, too. Mrs. Carson's place is still a fair piece away." "We will," Abigail assured him, "and thank you for the warning." The boy tipped his hat before disappearing back into the brush, presumably to find another vantage point to watch for his sister. Once he was gone, Clara sagged against the wagon wheel, her brief show of strength fading. "They're watching the trails," she whispered, "just like before." Abigail helped her back onto the wagon seat. "All the more reason to reach Martha's quickly," she said, hitching Samson with efficient movements despite her unwieldy condition. The boy was right about one thing. We need to be careful. As they continued their journey, Abigail found herself scrutinizing every rock formation, every clump of brush that might conceal a watcher. The revolver rested in her lap now, rather than her pocket, its weight both reassuring and a reminder of their vulnerability. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly as they followed the winding trail through increasingly rugged terrain. Abigail kept Samson to a steady pace, not wanting to tire the horse, but anxious to reach the safety of Martha's ranch. Clara dozed fitfully beside her, exhaustion from her still healing injuries claiming her, despite the jolting of the wagon. Abigail let her sleep, knowing she needed the rest to continue recovering. Around midday, the trail began to climb, winding up a series of switchbacks that offered views of the valley below. Abigail paused at one such vantage point, giving Samson a chance to catch his breath while she surveyed the path they'd traveled. Far below, a plume of dust caught her attention. Riders moving fast along the trail they'd just traversed. 3, maybe 4 horsemen, too distant to make out clearly, but moving with purpose. Abigail's heart quickened. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the boy's warning echoed in her mind. "Clara," she said softly, touching the younger woman's shoulder. "Wake up." Clara startled awake, instantly alert, in the way of those accustomed to danger. "What is it?" Abigail nodded toward the dust plume. "Riders, coming up the trail behind us." Clara's face drained of color. "How many?" "Can't tell for certain. 3 or 4. JKS usually travels in groups of 3, Clara said, her voice tight with fear. "1 to handle the horses, 2 to subdue their targets." Abigail assessed their options quickly. The trail ahead continued up the hillside, exposed and vulnerable. To either side, the terrain was too rough for the wagon. "We can't outrun them," she said grimly. "Not with the wagon, and we're too exposed here." Clara's gaze darted around frantically before settling on something beyond Abigail's shoulder. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow gap in the rocks, about 50 yards off the trail. "It might be big enough for the wagon." Abigail squinted at the opening. It was a risk. The gap might prove too narrow, or it might lead to a dead end, trapping them completely. But staying on the open trail seemed an even greater danger. "Hold tight," she said, flicking the reins. Samson responded with a burst of speed that belied his age, pulling the wagon off the trail and toward the gap in the rocks. The ground grew increasingly uneven, the wagon bouncing and lurching alarmingly. Abigail gritted her teeth against the jarring impacts, one hand braced protectively over her belly. Beside her, Clara clung to the seat, her knuckles white with tension. As they approached the gap, Abigail's heart sank. It was narrower than it had appeared from a distance. Perhaps wide enough for the wagon, but with little room to spare. "We'll have to try," she muttered, guiding Samson directly toward the opening. The wagon scraped against rock on both sides as they entered the gap, the sound setting Abigail's teeth on edge. She urged Samson forward, praying the axles would hold, and that the passage wouldn't narrow further. For 30 agonizing seconds, they inched through the gap, wood groaning against stone. Then suddenly they were through, emerging into a small box canyon. Sheer rock walls rose on 3 sides, with the narrow gap they'd just traversed providing the only obvious entrance or exit. "It's a dead end," Clara said, dismay evident in her voice. "But defensible," Abigail countered, already assessing their position with a strategist's eye. "One way in, one way out, and they'd have to come through that gap one at a time." She guided the wagon to the far side of the canyon, where an overhang provided some shade before pulling Samson to a halt. The horse was lathered with sweat sides, heaving from the exertion. "Help me unhitch him," Abigail said, climbing down from the wagon with Clara's assistance. "He's done enough for now." Together they freed Samson from the traces, allowing him to drink from a small pool of rainwater that had collected in a depression in the rock. Abigail retrieved the revolver and her medical bag from the wagon, along with a small bundle of supplies. "If it comes to it, we make our stand here," she said, checking that the revolver was fully loaded. "But with luck, they'll pass by without noticing where we left the trail." Clara looked dubious but nodded, helping Abigail arrange their supplies in the shadiest spot beneath the overhang. "You should rest," Clara said, noting the way Abigail pressed a hand to her lower back. The baby and I are fine," Abigail interrupted, though she did lower herself carefully to sit on a flat rock. "Just sore from the ride." Clara settled beside her, both women's gazes fixed on the narrow gap through which they'd entered. Minutes stretched into an hour as they waited in tense silence, listening for any sound that might indicate pursuit. "Maybe they weren't following us after all," Clara ventured eventually. As if in answer to her words, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them, growing steadily louder. Abigail raised the revolver, her expression grim. "Get behind the wagon," she instructed. "If anything happens to me, take Samson and ride for Martha's. Don't look back." Clara shook her head vehemently. "I'm not leaving you." Before Abigail could argue, a voice called from beyond the gap. "Hello in there, Mrs. Hayes, Clara. It's Martha Carson." Relief flooded through Abigail, so intense she nearly dropped the revolver. "Martha," she called back, though she kept the weapon ready, wary of a trap. A moment later, Martha Carson's wiry figure appeared in the gap, leading a mule. Behind her came 2 men, one middle-aged with a silver-streaked beard, the other younger, but with a similar bearing that marked them as related. "Thank the Lord," Martha said, hurrying toward them. "When I saw your wagon tracks leaving the trail, I feared the worst." "How did you know it was us?" Abigail asked, finally lowering the revolver as she recognized Martha's companions as her neighbors, the Hendersons' father and son. "Got word from the Tyler boy that you were on your way to my place," Martha explained, her sharp eyes taking in their disheveled appearance. "When you didn't arrive by noon, I got worried and asked the Hendersons to ride out with me." Clara remained tense, eyeing the men warily until Abigail gave her a reassuring nod. "We thought we were being followed," Abigail explained. "Saw riders on the trail behind us." John Henderson, the elder of the 2 men, nodded grimly. "Likely the same bunch that's been causing trouble all over the territory. We passed 3 riders headed back down the trail about a mile back. They didn't look friendly." "You took a risk coming off the trail," his son David added, "but it might have saved your lives. Those men have been taking women from homesteads and trails for months now. Sheriff can't or won't do anything about it." Abigail and Clara exchanged significant glances at this confirmation of JKS's continued activities. "That's actually why we were coming to see you, Martha," Abigail said. "We need to talk. Privately." Martha's expression sharpened with interest, but she merely nodded. "Let's get you to my place first. It's safer there." With the Hendersons' help, they hitched Samson back to the wagon and maneuvered it carefully back through the narrow gap. The return journey to the main trail was tense, everyone scanning the surroundings for signs of danger, but they encountered no one. "We'll escort you the rest of the way," John Henderson said as they reached the trail. "Safety in numbers." Abigail didn't argue, grateful for the additional protection. As they traveled the remaining distance to Martha's ranch, the child within her kicked and shifted restlessly, as if sensing her lingering anxiety. Soon, she murmured, her hand gentle on her belly. "Soon we'll be safe." But even as she spoke the words, Abigail knew they weren't entirely true. Safety was an illusion in a world where men like those in JKS operated freely. A world where her husband had been murdered for trying to bring them to justice. She glanced at Clara, seeing the same knowledge reflected in the younger woman's eyes. They might reach Martha's ranch safely today, but their journey, the one Matthew had started and they now continued, was far from over, and the most dangerous path still lay ahead. Martha Carson's ranch sat nestled against a limestone ridge, protected from the worst of the desert winds. Unlike Abigail's more modest homestead, Martha's place spoke of decades of hard work and careful stewardship. The main house, built of sturdy adobe with a wooden porch stretching across the front, was flanked by well-maintained outbuildings. A corral held several horses, and beyond it, cattle grazed in a pasture fed by a spring-fed creek. It was a testament to what could be built in this harsh land with enough time and determination. A legacy Martha had created alongside her husband until his death, and then continued alone with the same fierce independence that defined her character. After seeing the Hendersons off with heartfelt thanks, Martha ushered Abigail and Clara inside. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, with something savory bubbling on the stove. "Sit," Martha commanded, gesturing to the worn but polished table. "You both look dead on your feet. Food first, then talk." Neither woman argued. The journey had drained what little reserves Clara had built up during her recovery, and Abigail's back ached fiercely from the hours in the wagon. They ate in near silence. A hearty stew that Martha served with fresh biscuits and strong coffee for herself, and Martha chamomile tea for Abigail. Only when the dishes were cleared did Martha settle across from them, her keen eyes moving between their faces. "Now," she said, folding her weathered hands on the table, "tell me what kind of trouble you're in." Abigail hesitated, glancing at Clara, who gave a small nod. "It's about Matthew," Abigail began. "His death wasn't just a bank robbery gone wrong." Over the next hour, they told Martha everything, from finding Clara in the barn to the revelations about Matthew's secret investigation, the JKS organization, and Sheriff Cooper's suspicious interest in Matthew's papers. Martha listened without interruption, her expression growing grimmer with each new detail. When they finished, she rose and moved to a cabinet, returning with a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. She poured a measure in 2 of them, sliding one toward Clara and keeping one for herself. "Medicinal," she said when Clara hesitated, "for the shock of reliving such things." To Abigail, she offered more tea. "Not for you in your condition, but Lord knows you could use something stronger." Abigail managed a small smile, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "What do you think, Martha? Are we chasing ghosts, or is there something to all this?" Martha took a deliberate sip of whiskey before answering. "I think your Matthew was a braver man than most, and it got him killed." Her gaze shifted to Clara. "And I think this young woman is lucky to be alive." "But do you believe us?" Clara pressed. "About JKS, about what they're doing?" "Child, I've lived in this territory for 40 years. I've seen what men are capable of when they think no one's watching." Martha's voice held the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Girls going missing isn't new, but the scale of it these past few years, that's different. Organized. And the law turning a blind eye that tells me someone powerful is involved." She rose again, moving to a chest in the corner. From it, she withdrew a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. "This was my daughter Rose," she said, placing the clipping on the table. 23 years ago, she left for California with her husband. They never arrived. The clipping showed a young woman with Martha's sharp eyes and determined chin, standing beside a lanky young man in front of a general store. I reported it to every sheriff and marshal between here and the coast, Martha continued. No one cared about another missing couple. Probably Indians, they said, or must have changed their minds about California. Abigail gently touched the clipping. I'm so sorry, Martha. It was a long time ago, Martha said, though the pain in her eyes belied the dismissive words. But every time I hear about another girl gone missing, I think of my Rose. Wonder if she met the same fate. She looked directly at Clara. That mark on your wrist, JKS. I've seen it before. Clara's hand moved instinctively to cover the crude tattoo. Where 8 years back, young woman stumbled onto my property half dead like you were. Had the same mark. Martha's expression darkened with the memory. She stayed just long enough to recover, then disappeared one night. Left a note saying she couldn't put me in danger. Never saw her again. Abigail leaned forward. Did she tell you anything about JKS? Not much. Said they were everywhere. Had eyes in every town. Martha sighed heavily. I reported it to the sheriff then too. Next thing I know, my barn burns down. Accident, they said. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Martha had been trying to help victims of JKS for years, long before Matthew began his investigation. This is bigger than we thought, Abigail murmured, one hand unconsciously moving to her belly as the child within shifted restlessly. Always was, Martha replied grimly. Question is, what do you plan to do about it? Clara looked startled. We came to you for help for safety. And you'll have it, Martha assured her. But I know that look in Abigail's eyes. Same look her husband had. They don't mean to just hide and hope for the best. Abigail met Martha's knowing gaze. Matthew died trying to expose JKS. I can't let that be for nothing. Even with a child on the way, Martha challenged, though there was no judgment in her tone, only concern. Especially with a child on the way, Abigail replied, her voice strengthening with a conviction. What kind of world am I bringing this baby into if I don't at least try to make it better? If I don't finish what Matthew started? Martha studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Thought you might say that. She turned to Clara. And you, this isn't your fight anymore. You've earned the right to walk away. Clara's fingers traced the outline of the silver bracelet on her wrist. Matthew's sister's bracelet. It became my fight the moment they took me, she said quietly. It'll be my fight until every girl they've taken is free or avenged. A look of approval flashed across Martha's weathered features. Well then, she said, refilling her glass, let's talk strategy. The conversation continued late into the evening, moving from the kitchen to the more comfortable sitting room as Abigail's back began to protest the hard chair. Martha proved to be a treasure trove of information about the territory. Hidden trails, abandoned mines and homesteads, watering holes known only to locals. If JKS has a new holding place, she reasoned, spreading a hand-drawn map across a low table, it's got to be somewhere remote but accessible, with water like Clara remembered. And defensible, Abigail added, thinking like the military nurse she'd once been. They'd want warning if anyone approached. Martha's gnarled finger traced a section of the map. There's an old Spanish mission in the foothills here. Been abandoned since before the war. Has a spring inside the walls, stone buildings that could be secured. High ground all around for lookouts. That fits, Clara said, leaning forward with interest. I remember stone walls and bells. I heard church bells once, though they sounded broken. Mission San Xavier, Martha nodded. The bells are still in the tower, though no one's rung them in decades. Abigail studied the location on the map. It's isolated but not too far from the main trail to Mexico, perfect for moving captives in and out without attracting attention. And less than a day's ride from here, Martha added, close enough to keep an eye on, far enough that most folks give it a wide berth. Place has a reputation for being haunted. The conversation paused as Abigail shifted uncomfortably, wincing as the baby delivered a particularly vigorous kick to her ribs. That child's restless tonight, Martha observed. Maybe time we all got some sleep. Been a long day and there's more planning to do tomorrow. Clara looked about to protest, but a yawn betrayed her exhaustion. Martha showed them to a small but clean bedroom with 2 narrow beds. Rose's room, Abigail realized with a pang, preserved all these years later. As they prepared for sleep, Clara spoke softly. Do you really think we can do this? Find their hideout free. The women exposed JKS. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, methodically unbraiding her hair. I don't know, she admitted, but Matthew believed it was possible. He gave his life trying. I have to believe we can finish what he started. You could have a normal life, Clara persisted. Raise your baby in peace. Let someone else fight this battle. Who, Abigail asked simply. The sheriff who might be involved, the townspeople who look the other way, the law that doesn't care about missing women. She shook her head. Sometimes God puts you in a position to act and not acting becomes the sin. Clara considered this absently, tracing the JKS brand on her wrist. In the holding place, she said after a moment, there was a girl couldn't have been more than 16. Rebecca. She used to sing at night very quietly to help the younger girls sleep. They took her away the day before I escaped. I keep wondering what happened to her. If she's still alive? If she still sings? The simple story told in Clara's quiet voice hung in the air between them, a reminder of the human cost behind their planning and strategizing. We'll find her if we can, Abigail promised. Her and all the others. Clara nodded, slipping under the covers and turning toward the wall. Abigail extinguished the lamp, but sleep eluded her despite her physical exhaustion. The child moved restlessly within her, and her mind raced with all they'd learned and all that still lay ahead. Matthew's face floated in her memory, not as she'd last seen him bloodied and still on a mortician's table, but as he'd been in life, laughing eyes crinkling at the corners, telling her about the house he'd build for them one day. A house that would now never exist. I'm trying, she whispered into the darkness, a message to a ghost. I'm trying to be as brave as you were. Eventually, she drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with fragmented dreams of running through stone corridors, searching for something she couldn't name, the sound of broken bells echoing in the distance. Morning brought a new sense of purpose. Over a breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, the three women refined their plan. First, they needed to confirm if the mission was indeed JKS's new holding place without alerting anyone to their interest. John Henderson trades with some of the Mexican farmers near the mission, Martha said. He could ask casual questions, see if anyone's noticed activity there. What about Cooper? Abigail asked. If he's involved with JKS, he'll be watching for any unusual interest in the area. Martha's expression hardened. That's why we women will do the real investigating. No one pays much mind to old women and expectant mothers. Clara raised an eyebrow. And me? You'll stay here for now, Martha said firmly. You're still healing, and you're the only one who can identify JKS members on site. Can't risk them seeing you. Clara looked ready to argue, but subsided when Abigail placed a gentle hand on her arm. She's right. Your knowledge is too valuable to risk. They spent the morning gathering supplies, food, water, medical necessities, and preparing for various contingencies. Martha pulled Abigail aside as Clara rested on the porch, still easily fatigued from her ordeal. This isn't just about Matthew anymore, is it? Martha asked quietly, her knowing eyes searching Abigail's face. Abigail sighed. It never was, not really. But now, she glanced toward Clara. Now I've seen what they do, the human cost. I can't unsee it. Martha nodded. Just making sure you know what you're risking. That child you're carrying deserves a mother. And those women deserve their freedom, Abigail countered. Their lives back, the chance to have children of their own someday. Martha studied her for a long moment before nodding, a hint of pride in her expression. You always were stubborn, even as a girl. I learned from the best, Abigail replied with a small smile, thinking of the many times Martha had stood her ground against men twice her size when she believed she was right. The older woman snorted. Flattery won't save you if this goes wrong. No, Abigail agreed soberly, but doing nothing won't save anyone else. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. Both women tensed, Martha reaching for the shotgun propped by the door, while Abigail hurried to get Clara inside. Stay in the back room, she instructed the younger woman. Don't come out unless one of us calls for you. Clara nodded, the fear in her eyes a sharp reminder of all she'd endured. Abigail squeezed her hand reassuringly before returning to Martha's side at the window. Henderson, Martha identified the rider with relief as he came into view. Earlier than expected. John Henderson dismounted before the porch, his expression grave as he removed his hat. Martha opened the door before he could knock. You look like you've seen a ghost, John, she said by way of greeting. Come in and sit before you fall over. Henderson followed her inside, nodding to Abigail. He accepted the coffee Martha poured, but seemed too agitated to sit. "Sheriff's been asking questions," he said without preamble. "About you, Abigail, and about any strangers you might have staying with you." Abigail's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "Said there was an incident at the bank in Prescott. Woman matching your description, trying to access your husband's safety deposit box." Henderson shook his head. "But you've been here the whole time, so it couldn't have been you." "No," Abigail agreed slowly. "It couldn't have." "Someone's trying to get to Matthew's papers," Martha concluded. "Someone who knows about the evidence he collected." Henderson looked between them, confusion evident on his weathered face. "Evidence? What evidence?" Martha gave him a brief explanation of JKS and Matthew's investigation, careful not to mention Clara's presence. Henderson's expression darkened with each new detail. "I knew something wasn't right about Matthew's death," he said when she finished. "Too neat. Too quick how they caught the supposed robber and hanged him before anyone could ask questions." "You believe us then?" Abigail asked. Henderson ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Wish I didn't, but yeah, things add up." He glanced toward the window. "There's more. Riders been seen near the old mission, not locals. Men with fancy guns and city boots pretending to be cowboys." Martha caught Abigail's eye. "Seems we were right about the location." "There's talk in town, too," Henderson continued, "about girls gone missing from as far as Tucson. Sheriff says it's just rumors, but my David's sweet on the telegraph operator's daughter. She says there have been wires from all over asking about missing young women." "How many?" Abigail asked quietly. "Dozen, maybe more, just in the last few months." Henderson's voice dropped. "David says the sheriff takes those wires straight to Judge Hollister before anyone else sees them." "Hollister," Martha repeated, her expression hardening, "always thought he was too friendly with certain businessmen from back east." Abigail filed away this new information. Judge Hollister had been mentioned in Matthew's journal as someone who might be connected to JKS, though Matthew hadn't been certain. "What are you ladies planning?" Henderson asked directly. "Whatever it is, you might want to move faster. Cooper's organized a posse supposedly looking for cattle rustlers. They're heading out tomorrow searching homesteads south of town." "Including mine," Abigail realized with a chill. If Cooper searched her ranch, he might find evidence of Clara's presence, or worse, the hidden journal and papers. "We need to get back," she said to Martha. "Tonight." Martha nodded grimly. "John, can you get word to David? Have him meet us at sundown with fresh horses. We'll need to travel fast and quiet." Henderson agreed readily. "David can guide you back to your place using the old Apache trails. Cooper and his men won't know those paths." As he left to arrange the details, Abigail hurried to the back room where Clara waited anxiously. "We have to go back to my ranch," she explained quickly. "Cooper's organized a search party that will reach it by tomorrow. If he finds Matthew's journal, we lose our only evidence." Clara finished already moving to gather her few belongings. "I heard. When do we leave?" "Sundown. David Henderson will guide us back using hidden trails." Abigail hesitated. "It will be dangerous. If you'd rather stay here with Martha..." Clara's expression hardened with determination. "I'm coming with you. I won't hide while you risk everything." Abigail nodded, respecting the younger woman's courage. "We'll leave as soon as it's dark." The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Martha packed supplies while Abigail studied the map, memorizing the route they would take. Clara rested, building her strength for the journey ahead. As sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and crimson, David Henderson arrived with 3 horses. His own sturdy bay, a gentle dun for Abigail, and a sure-footed pinto for Clara. "My father told me everything," the young man said as they prepared to depart. "I want to help. Rebecca Wilson, one of the missing girls, she was my friend." Abigail saw the pain in his eyes and understood. This wasn't just about justice in the abstract for him. It was personal. "We welcome your help," she said sincerely, "but understand the danger. If Cooper is involved with JKS..." "I don't care," David interrupted, his jaw set in a stubborn line reminiscent of his father. "Rebecca deserves better than to be forgotten." Martha approached, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "My Henry's rifle," she said, pressing it into David's hands. "Good for shooting men at a distance." The casual way she said it sent a chill down Abigail's spine, a reminder that Martha's gentle exterior concealed a woman who had survived the harshest realities of frontier life. "You're not coming?" Clara asked, surprised. Martha shook her head. "Someone needs to stay and tell John where you've gone if you don't return by morning." Besides, she added with a grim smile, Cooper won't suspect an old woman of anything. Abigail embraced her, feeling the surprising strength in Martha's wiry frame. Thank you for everything. Just come back alive, Martha whispered. All of you. Mounting was awkward for Abigail, her pregnant belly making it difficult to sit comfortably in the saddle. David had thoughtfully provided a side saddle, which helped somewhat, but the journey ahead would still be uncomfortable. As they set off, Abigail cast one last glance at Martha's ranch, a haven of safety they were willingly leaving behind. The baby kicked vigorously as if protesting the jostling motion of the horse beneath them. Not much longer, little one, she murmured, one hand gentle on her belly. Soon we'll have the answers we need. David led them away from the main trail, immediately cutting across country toward a line of low hills. Twilight deepened around them, the first stars appearing in the eastern sky as the last light faded in the west. We'll follow the ridge line, David explained in a low voice. Old Apache hunting trail. Not many white men know it exists. How do you know it? Clara asked curiously. A sad smile touched David's lips. My mother was Apache. She showed me many things before she died. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as they navigated the narrow, winding trail. The moon rose nearly full, providing enough light to see by without risking a lantern that might attract attention. Around midnight, they paused in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and allow Abigail some relief from the saddle. Her back ached fiercely and she moved stiffly as David helped her dismount. We're making good time, he assured them, offering a canteen of water. Should reach your ranch before dawn if we keep this pace. Clara stayed close to Abigail, concern evident in her expression. Are you sure you can continue? You look exhausted. I'm fine, Abigail insisted, though in truth the journey was taking a greater toll than she'd anticipated. The child within her seemed unusually active, responding to her tension and discomfort with vigorous movement. They rested for half an hour before continuing the trail, growing steeper and more challenging as they approached a pass between two hills. David rode ahead slightly, scouting the path. Suddenly he reined in sharply, raising a hand in warning. The women halted, instantly alert. Riders, David whispered, pointing toward the valley below, coming up the main trail. Abigail and Clara dismounted carefully, joining David at a vantage point among the rocks. Far below, moonlight gleamed on metal, gun barrels or badges impossible to tell at this distance. 4 men on horseback moving at a steady pace toward the pass. Cooper, Abigail breathed. David shook his head. Can't tell, but they're heading toward your ranch on the main trail. We need to get there first. Is there another way? Clara asked, anxiety tightening her voice. Yes, but it's rougher terrain. Can you manage it? David's question was directed at Abigail, his concern evident. Abigail straightened, ignoring the persistent ache in her lower back. I'll manage. Lead on. They remounted and David guided them along an even narrower path that skirted the edge of the hills, occasionally disappearing entirely among rocks and scrub. The horses picked their way carefully, sure-footed, but slow on the treacherous ground. The moon had begun its descent toward the western horizon when they finally caught sight of Abigail's ranch in the distance. The small cabin and barn stood dark and silent, no sign of the riders they'd spotted earlier. We beat them here, Clara said with relief. For now, David cautioned, they can't be far behind. They approached, cautiously alert for any sign of ambush or previous intrusion. The cabin appeared undisturbed, exactly as they'd left it days before. Once inside, Abigail moved immediately to the fireplace, lifting the loose brick to retrieve Matthew's journal and papers. Everything remained as she'd left it, untouched. We need to move quickly, she said, gathering the materials into a leather satchel. Pack only what's essential. If Cooper is coming here, specifically to search for evidence, we can't be here when he arrives. Clara hurried to collect their few personal belongings while David kept watch from the window. Abigail added medicines and bandages from her supply to the satchel, along with the revolver and ammunition. Someone's coming, David warned suddenly, his voice a tense whisper. Single rider moving fast. Abigail joined him at the window, peering into the pre-dawn gloom. A lone figure on horseback approached at a gallop, the horse's sides heaving with exertion. Not Cooper, David murmured. Too small. As the rider drew closer, Abigail gasped in recognition. It's Martha's boy, Tommy, the one who works at the telegraph office. David unbarred the door, stepping onto the porch as the young rider reined in before the cabin. Tommy slid from his lathered horse, his young face grave beneath his cap. "Mrs. Hayes," he panted, nodding respectfully to Abigail, who had followed David outside. "Mrs. Carson sent me, said it couldn't wait till morning." "What is it, Tommy?" Abigail asked, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. "Sheriff Cooper arrested Mrs. Carson right after you left." Tommy said, the words tumbling out in his haste. "Charged her with harboring fugitives. They're holding her in the town jail." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "On what evidence?" "Someone informed," Tommy replied grimly, "said they saw a woman matching the description of one being sought for questioning staying at Mrs. Carson's place." Clara had joined them on the porch, her face pale in the faint light of approaching dawn. "Me," she whispered. "They're after me." Tommy's gaze flickered to her curiously, but he continued his message. "Mrs. Carson managed to get word to me before they locked her up. Said to tell you the bells will ring at noon tomorrow. Said you'd understand." The mission. Martha was telling them to proceed with investigating San Xavier despite her arrest. "There's more," Tommy added, his young face troubled. "Judge Hollister arrived in town yesterday. He's called a special court session for tomorrow morning. They're saying Mrs. Carson will stand trial then." "That's not enough time to prepare a defense," David protested. "It's not legal." "Nothing about this is legal," Abigail said grimly. "It's a show trial, a message to anyone who might interfere with JKS. She turned to Tommy. "Thank you for bringing this news. It was brave of you to ride all this way." The boy straightened with pride. "Mrs. Carson's always been good to my family. Ma said to help however I can." "You can help by getting word to your father," David said. "Tell him what's happened and that we need men we can trust. Men willing to stand against corruption, even if it wears a badge." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Pa already knows something's wrong. Half the town does the way they arrested Mrs. Carson. Dragged her out of her house in her nightclothes, they did." Anger flashed in David's eyes. "My father will gather men. Good men. Where should they meet us?" Abigail considered quickly. "The old Pearson mine. It's abandoned, but the entrance is still stable. 3 miles east of the mission." Tommy committed this to memory before mounting his exhausted horse. "I'll get word to everyone Mrs. Carson would trust," he promised. "By noon tomorrow, you'll have help." As the boy galloped away, Abigail turned to the others, her expression grim but determined. "We need to move. If Cooper sent men here, they'll arrive soon." "Where are we going?" Clara asked, clutching the small bundle of their belongings. "The mission," Abigail replied. "We need to confirm it's JKS's holding place before Martha's trial. It's the only way to save her and expose them." David looked dubious. "Just the 3 of us against an entire JKS operation." "We're not going to attack," Abigail clarified. "Just confirm its location and gather evidence. Then we meet your father and the others at the mine to plan next steps." Clara touched the JKS brand on her wrist, a determined light entering her eyes. "I know the layout of their previous holding place. If the mission is similar, I can help identify where they keep the Women Guard rotation's weaknesses." David still seemed uncertain but nodded his agreement. "My father will bring men, good fighters. If we know what we're facing, we stand a chance." They worked quickly, loading their supplies onto the horses. Dawn was breaking in earnest now, the eastern sky lightening to pearl gray. They needed to be well away before full daylight exposed them to any observers. As Abigail secured the last of their provisions, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and clutch the saddle for support. "Abigail!" Clara was at her side, instantly concern written across her features. "I'm fine." Abigail managed breathing deeply as the pain subsided. "Just a cramp from riding too long." Clara didn't look convinced, but there was no time for further discussion. The sound of distant hoofbeats reached them. Multiple riders approaching from the direction of town. "Cooper's men," David said tersely. "We need to go, now." They mounted hastily, Abigail gritting her teeth against the discomfort. David led them away from the cabin, not toward the main trail, but across the scrubland toward a dry wash that would conceal their tracks. As they rode, Abigail cast one last glance at the small ranch she and Matthew had called home. In the growing light, it looked vulnerable and exposed, much like she felt herself. Everything familiar was falling away, replaced by danger and uncertainty. Yet beneath the fear, a core of determination burned steadily. Matthew had died for this cause. Martha was willing to face a corrupt court for it. The women JKS had taken deserved no less courage from her. The baby shifted within her, a reminder of all she had to lose and all she was fighting to protect. She straightened in the saddle, facing forward as they rode toward the unknown. They traveled throughout the morning, avoiding main trails and settlements, guided by David's knowledge of the territory's hidden paths. The mission lay approximately 15 miles southwest of Abigail's ranch, a journey that would have taken half a day on the main roads, but stretched longer on the circuitous route they were forced to take. Around midday, they paused in the shelter of a rocky overhang, the horses and riders alike needing rest. The November sun beat down mercilessly despite the lateness of the season, and water was becoming a concern. "There's a spring about 2 miles ahead," David said, studying the terrain. "We can refill our canteens there before making the final approach to the mission." Abigail nodded, easing herself down from the saddle with David's assistance. The periodic pain she'd been experiencing had increased in frequency, but she kept this to herself. There was too much at stake to delay because of what were likely just false labor pains. Common Dr. Wilson had assured her in the late stages of pregnancy. Clara distributed the last of their jerky and hardtack, watching Abigail with concern. "You're very pale," she observed quietly. "Are you sure you're all right?" "Just tired," Abigail replied, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's been a long journey." Clara didn't look convinced, but didn't press the issue. They ate in relative silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. "We should reach the mission by late afternoon," David said eventually, brushing crumbs from his shirt. "We'll approach from the east, through the old arroyo. It'll give us cover almost to the walls." "How close can we get safely?" Abigail asked. "There's a ridge about a quarter-mile away with a good view of the compound. We can observe from there, see if there's activity that matches what Clara remembers." Clara nodded. "I'll know JKS operations when I see them. They have patterns, ways of moving captives, posting guards." Abigail felt a surge of gratitude for the younger woman's courage. Despite all she'd suffered, Clara was willing to revisit the nightmare of her captivity to help others. "Once we confirm it's them," Abigail said, "we'll need to get word to John Henderson and the others at the mine." "I can do that," David offered. "You two stay at the observation point while I ride to the meeting place." Clara shook her head firmly. "We stay together. It's safer." "She's right," Abigail agreed. "We've come too far to separate now. We'll observe until we have what we need, then all go to the mine together." David acquiesced, though reluctance was clear in his expression. He helped the women back onto their horses, his concern for Abigail's condition evident in his careful assistance. They continued their journey, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as they approached the foothills, where the old Spanish mission was located. The vegetation thin, giving way to rock and sparse tough grasses. Here and there, the skeletal remains of trees, long dead, reached toward the sky like accusatory fingers. As promised, they soon came upon a small spring, little more than a seep emerging from between rocks, but the water was clear and cool. They refilled canteens and allowed the horses to drink their fill before moving on. The sun had begun its westward descent when David raised a hand signaling a halt. "We're close," he murmured. "From here we go on foot." They dismounted, securing the horses in a sheltered draw where they would have shade and enough vegetation to graze. David took only Martha's rifle and a canteen. Abigail brought her medical bag and Matthew's journal, while Clara carried their remaining food and water. The approach to the observation point David had mentioned was more difficult than Abigail had anticipated. The arroyo provided cover, but the footing was treacherous, loose rock and sand that shifted underfoot. Every step required concentration, and the periodic pains in her abdomen grew sharper with the exertion. "Not much further," David encouraged, offering his arm when Abigail stumbled slightly. Finally, they reached a natural terrace in the rocky hillside, screened by stunted junipers, but offering a clear view of the valley below. And there, perhaps half a mile distant, stood Mission San Xavier. Even in ruin, it maintained a certain austere beauty. The main church, with its bell tower, dominated the compound, surrounded by the remains of smaller buildings and a stone wall that had once enclosed the entire mission. Parts of the wall had crumbled with time, but Abigail could see evidence of recent repairs, sections of new stonework patching the gaps. "Someone's been restoring it," she murmured. "Not restoring," Clara corrected, her voice tight. "Fortifying." She was right. Looking more carefully, Abigail could see that the repairs were focused on security rather than historical preservation. The gaps in the wall had been filled with an eye toward defense, and what appeared to be a guard post had been constructed atop the bell tower. David passed her a small brass spyglass. "Take a closer look. Northeast corner." Abigail extended the spyglass and focused on the area he indicated. There, partially concealed behind one of the outbuildings, stood a large wagon with a canvas cover. As she watched, two men emerge from the building, carrying what appeared to be supplies toward the main church. "They're not dressed like priests," she noted dryly. "No," Clara agreed, her face pale as she accepted the spyglass from Abigail. "Those are guards, same type that watched us in the previous holding." She studied the compound intently, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as memories clearly assailed her. "There," she said, finally pointing to a low stone building attached to the main church. "That's where they'll keep the women, away from the main entrance but connected to the church for easy movement if needed." David took his turn with the spyglass. "I count 4 men visible, probably more inside." "At the other holding, they kept 2 guards on the women at all times," Clara said. 2 at the main entrance and at least 2 patrolling the perimeter, plus whoever was in charge. 7 or 8 men minimum, Abigail calculated. Too many for us to handle alone. "Henderson's men will help," David said confidently. "My father said he could gather at least a dozen willing to fight." "If they arrive in time," Abigail reminded him, "Martha's trial is tomorrow morning." "By my morning. We need evidence before then if we're going to save her." Clara's grip tightened on the spyglass. "We need more than just confirmation that it's JKS. We need proof of who's involved, especially if Cooper and Judge Hollister are part of it." Abigail considered their options. The pain in her abdomen had settled into a dull, persistent ache, allowing her to think more clearly. "We need to get closer, see inside if possible." David looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "That's too dangerous, especially in your condition." "I'm not suggesting we storm the place," Abigail clarified, "but there must be a way to get a better look without being seen." Clara was still studying the mission through the spyglass. "The old cemetery," she said suddenly, "behind the church. The walls are lower there, and there appear to be trees for cover." David took the spyglass back, focusing on the area she indicated. "She's right. The wall's half collapsed on that side, but it's also farther from where they're keeping the women." "But closer to the main church where the leaders would likely stay," Abigail pointed out. "If we could see inside, maybe identify who's in charge." A heavy silence fell as they all considered the risk. Getting closer meant potentially exposing themselves to discovery, but remaining at a distance might not yield the evidence they needed. "I'll go," Clara said finally. "I know what to look for, how they operate." "No," Abigail and David said simultaneously. "You're the only one who can identify JKS members on site," Abigail continued. "If you're captured, we lose that advantage. Besides, if they recognize you—" She didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew what JKS would do to an escaped captive. "I'll go," David offered. "I'm the most familiar with moving unseen in this kind of terrain." Abigail was about to agree when another pain seized her sharper than before. She gasped, doubling over slightly before she could stop herself. Clara was at her side instantly. "That's not just fatigue," she said accusingly. "How long have you been having these pains?" "Since this morning," Abigail admitted, straightening as the contraction eased. "But they're irregular, probably just false labor." "Or real labor brought on by stress and exertion," Clara countered, concern evident in her voice. "You can't possibly go down there." "I wasn't planning to, but," Abigail assured us. "David should go. He's right. He has the best chance of getting close undetected." David looked uncertain, glancing between Abigail's pale face and the mission below. "If you're in labor, I shouldn't leave you." "I'm a nurse," Abigail reminded him, "and Clara's here. Besides, these could be false pains. They've been coming all day without getting significantly stronger or more regular." Even as she spoke, she wasn't entirely convinced of her own assessment. The pains did seem to be intensifying, though they remained irregular. "We don't have time to debate this," she continued firmly. "Martha's trial is tomorrow morning. We need evidence now." David hesitated a moment longer before nodding reluctantly. "I'll go now while there's still daylight. The setting sun will be in their eyes if they look this way, making it harder to spot movement on this side of the valley." He checked Martha's rifle, ensuring it was loaded before setting it carefully beside Abigail. "Keep this with you. 1 shot if you're in trouble, 2 if you see riders approaching from town. I'll come back immediately either way. Abigail nodded, gripping his hand briefly. Be careful. Observe only. Don't take unnecessary risks. I'll be back before full dark. He promised, then slipped away, moving down the rocky slope with the sure-footed grace inherited from his Apache mother. Clara settled beside Abigail, her expression troubled. You should have told us about the pains earlier. And what would that have changed? Abigail asked gently. We still need to confirm JKS is operating here. We still need evidence to save Martha. Clara had no answer for that. Instead, she helped Abigail find a more comfortable position against a rock, then unpack their remaining water and food. Try to rest, she suggested. Save your strength. Abigail nodded, though rest seemed impossible with her mind racing and her body increasingly uncomfortable. She watched through the spyglass as David made his way across the valley floor using every bit of available cover. He moved well, she had to admit. If she hadn't known to look for him, she might never have spotted his progress. Time passed slowly. The sun sank lower, painting the stone buildings of the mission in golden light that gradually deepened to amber, then crimson. Activity within the compound diminished as evening approached. Twice Abigail saw men patrolling the walls, confirming Clara's description of JKS security protocols. Another contraction seized her, this one strong enough to make her bite her lip to keep from crying out. Clara watched her with increasing concern. How far apart are they? She asked when Abigail's breathing returned to normal. Irregular, Abigail replied. 20 minutes, then 40, then 15. If it was true labor, they'd be getting steadily closer together. Unless something's wrong, Clara said quietly. Abigail met her gaze steadily. If something's wrong, there's little we can do about it here. So let's focus on what we can control. She turned her attention back to the mission, where the deepening shadows made it increasingly difficult to track David's progress. He had reached the cemetery, she thought, though she could no longer make out his figure clearly. He should be at the wall by now, Clara murmured, sharing the spyglass. If he can get a look inside the church. A sudden flurry of activity at the mission's main gate interrupted her. The heavy wooden doors swung open and a rider entered at a canter. Even at this distance, the glint of a badge was visible on the man's chest. Cooper, Abigail breathed a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The sheriff dismounted, greeted by two men who emerged from the church. One took his horse while Cooper and the other man conversed briefly before entering the building. He's involved, Clara said grimly, just as we suspected. But is he a leader or just a pawn? Abigail wondered aloud. We need to know who he's meeting with inside. They watched intently as lights appeared in the church windows, shadows moving within. David was nowhere to be seen, but Abigail hoped he was close enough to observe whatever meeting was taking place. Another contraction gripped her stronger than the last. She closed her eyes, breathing through it, as she'd instructed countless women to do during her nursing days. When she opened them again, Clara was watching her with naked worry. That one was worse, she observed, and closer to the last. Abigail couldn't deny it. About 12 minutes, she admitted, but still not regular enough to be active labor. Active enough, Clara countered. We need to get you somewhere safer than this rocky hillside. Before Abigail could respond, movement near the mission caught their attention. A new figure had emerged from the church. Tall, distinguished, dressed, not in frontier clothing, but in what appeared to be a suit. Who is that? Clara wondered, raising the spyglass. Abigail took it from her, focusing on the newcomer with a growing sense of dread. Even in the fading light, there was no mistaking that imperious bearing, that carefully trimmed beard. Judge Hollister, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The same man who's presiding over Martha's trial tomorrow. Clara's intake of breath was audible. The judge is part of JKS. Looks that way. Abigail continued watching as Cooper and Hollister conversed on the church steps, their manner suggesting a relationship of equals rather than the deference one might expect a sheriff to show a judge. A third man joined them, this one younger with the bearing of someone used to giving orders. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar to Abigail, though she couldn't place why. Do you recognize him? She asked Clara, passing her the spyglass. Clara studied the man for a long moment before shaking her head. I never saw the highest leaders. They kept themselves separate from the day-to-day operations. Abigail took the spyglass back, focusing on the third man. There was something in his features, his gestures. Another contraction interrupted her thoughts, this one intense enough to make her gasp aloud. The spyglass slipped from her fingers, clattering against the rocks before Clara managed to catch it. That was less than 10 minutes, Clara said urgently. Abigail, this is active labor. We need to get you to shelter. Abigail wanted to argue but found she couldn't. The pain was becoming unmistakable, the pattern increasingly regular. Her baby, it seemed, had decided that today was the day regardless of the circumstances. We have to wait for David, she managed once the contraction passed. He needs to know what we've seen. Clara looked torn between concern for Abigail and the necessity of completing their mission. If he's not back within the hour, I'll have to go find him, she decided. You can't give birth on this hillside. Abigail nodded weakly, conserving her strength. The timing couldn't have been worse, yet there was a certain bitter irony to it. Life asserting itself in the midst of their investigation into so much death and suffering. They continued their vigil as darkness fell in earnest, the only light now coming from the mission windows in the rising moon. Cooper Hollister and the third man had returned inside, denying them further observation of whatever meeting was taking place. Abigail's contractions continued, gradually increasing in intensity and regularity. Clara timed them anxiously, using the star's movement as a rough clock. 8 minutes, she reported after the latest, and lasting nearly a minute. Abigail nodded, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cooling night air. Not imminent, she assured Clara. First babies often take their time. Could be hours yet. Hours we don't have, Clara pointed out. David should have been back by now. Abigail shared her concern. The young man had been gone far longer than planned, and full darkness had fallen over the valley. Had he been captured, or was he simply being cautious in his return, waiting for an opportune moment? Another contraction began building, and Abigail braced herself against the rock face. As the pain reached its peak, she bit down hard on her knuckle to stifle any sound that might carry in the still night air. When it passed, she became aware of Clara tensely scanning the darkness below. "What is it?" she asked. "Movement," Clara whispered. "Near the cemetery. I can't tell if it's David or someone else." Abigail strained her eyes, but in the darkness, she could make out nothing beyond vague shadows. "Give him time," she counseled. "If it's David, rushing him might expose him to danger." Clara nodded reluctantly, though her body remained tense with readiness. They waited in silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and Abigail's carefully controlled breathing. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, a shadow detached itself from the darkness near their position. Clara raised Martha's rifle, her finger hovering near the trigger. "It's me," came David's hushed voice. "Don't shoot." Clara lowered the weapon with visible relief as David climbed the last few yards to their position. His clothes were dusty and torn in places, and a long scratch marked one cheek. "What happened?" Abigail asked, noting the grim set of his features. "I got close enough to see inside," he reported, dropping to a crouch beside them. "Through a broken window near the back of the church. They're meeting in what used to be the nave. Cooper, Judge Hollister, and a man I didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed, younger than the others." Clara described the third man they had observed. David nodded. "They were discussing shipments, women they have taken or plan to take, and Martha's trial." Abigail's blood ran cold. "What about Martha?" "It's a sham, as we suspected. Hollister plans to find her guilty, regardless of evidence, make an example of her." David's voice hardened with anger. "They mentioned you too, Abigail. Said once Martha's dealt with, you're next." Clara gripped Abigail's hand tightly. "Did you hear any names, anything we could use to identify the third man or other JKS members?" "Better," David replied, producing a folded paper from inside his shirt. "I found this in a saddlebag outside. It's a ledger page. Names, dates, amounts paid for, merchandise." Abigail took the paper with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully. Even in the dim moonlight, the neat columns of figures were visible, along with names that made her breath catch. Prominent men from across the territory, even as far as California, with amounts beside each entry that could only represent payments for women sold. "This is it," she whispered. "The evidence we need." A powerful contraction seized her before she could say more, stronger than any before. She doubled over, unable to suppress a low moan of pain. David looked alarmed. "What's wrong with her?" "She's in labor," Clara explained tersely. "Has been for hours, but didn't tell us until it was too advanced to turn back." "Labor," David repeated, his voice rising slightly before he controlled it. "We need to get her to safety." "The mine?" "No time," Abigail gasped as the contraction finally eased. "That one was different. Stronger. The baby's coming soon. Clara and David exchanged panicked glances. We can't deliver a baby here, David protested. Not on this hillside with JKS less than a mile away. We need shelter, water, clean cloths, Clara agreed. Is there anywhere closer than the mine? David thought quickly. There's a line shack about 2 miles north, used during cattle drives, probably empty this time of year. Can you get her there? Clara asked. I'm right here, Abigail reminded them with a touch of asperity. And yes, I can make it 2 miles. Between contractions, I can walk or ride. David still looked doubtful, but another contraction, arriving barely 6 minutes after the last, decided the matter. They couldn't stay here exposed on the hillside with Abigail's labor progressing rapidly. I'll get the horses, David said, gathering his rifle and the precious ledger page. Clara helped her prepare to move. As he disappeared into the darkness, Clara helped Abigail to her feet, supporting her as they slowly made their way down from the observation point toward where they'd left the horses. Of all the times for this child to decide to arrive, Abigail murmured, attempting humor despite the gravity of their situation. He's his father's son, Clara replied with a small smile, determined to be in the middle of the action. The reference to Matthew sent a pang through Abigail's heart. He should have been here for this moment, anxiously pacing, holding her hand, welcoming their child into the world. Instead, she was in the wilderness with near strangers in danger, while the men responsible for Matthew's death met less than a mile away. The irony was almost too much to bear. By the time they reached the horses, another contraction was building. Abigail leaned against a boulder, breathing deeply as the pain washed over her. When it passed, she found David watching her with concern. They're getting closer together, he observed. Can you ride? I'll have to, Abigail replied grimly. Help me up. Mounting was an ordeal, but with David and Clara's assistance, Abigail managed to settle sideways on the horse, her legs draped over one side of the saddle. David led her horse while Clara rode beside them, all three acutely aware of the need for silence as they moved away from the mission. The 2-mile journey to the line shack felt interminable. Each step of the horse sent jolts of discomfort through Abigail's already strained body, and the contractions continued to intensify. Twice they had to stop completely, while she weathered particularly powerful ones, biting her lip until it bled to keep from crying out. Finally, a small dark shape appeared ahead, the line shack David had mentioned. Little more than a one-room cabin with a lean-to for horses, it nonetheless represented safety and shelter in their desperate situation. David dismounted quickly, checking that the shack was indeed empty before helping Abigail down from her horse. Her legs buckled as another contraction seized her, and he caught her, practically carrying her the last few steps to the cabin door. Inside the shack was bare but clean enough. A plank table, 2 rough chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, and a small iron stove. Clara immediately set about gathering what they had in terms of clean fabric. A spare shirt from David's saddlebag, bandages from Abigail's medical kit. Water. Abigail managed between panting breaths. We need water. There's a pump out back, David said. I'll get some and see to the horses. He hurried out, clearly relieved to have a task that took him away from the imminent birthing process. Clara helped Abigail to the cot, easing her down as gently as possible. I wish Martha were here, Clara said anxiously, or any woman with experience in these matters. I've delivered dozens of babies, Abigail reminded her, attempting a reassuring smile that turned into a grimace as another contraction began. I can talk you through what needs to be done. Clara nodded, though fear was evident in her eyes. Tell me what to do. As the night deepened around the isolated cabin, Abigail Hayes prepared to bring new life into a world fraught with danger. The child within her, impatient as its father had been, was determined to arrive now in this place under these circumstances. And despite everything, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring, Abigail felt a surge of fierce love for this stubborn, ill-timed baby. Matthew's child, her child, a new beginning in the midst of their fight for justice. All right, she said as the contraction eased and David returned with the water. Let's bring this child into the world. Pain had a way of making time meaningless. For Abigail, the hours blurred together in a haze of contractions, brief respites, and the growing certainty that her child was determined to enter the world on its own terms. The line shack had become a makeshift birthing room illuminated by a single lantern David had found and lit with trembling hands. Clara moved with surprising composure, following Abigail's breathless instructions as she prepared what little they had for the delivery. The contractions are less than 3 minutes apart now. Clara reported, her fingers gentle on Abigail's wrist as she monitored her pulse, and lasting nearly a minute each. Abigail nodded, conserving her strength between pains. Soon, she murmured. Very soon. David had retreated to the small porch, keeping watch while giving the women privacy. Occasionally, Clara would call for more water or another piece of wood for the small stove they'd lit to ward off the night's chill, and he would comply without meeting their eyes. He's more frightened than we are, Clara observed with a hint of amusement as he disappeared again. Most men are when it comes to childbirth, Abigail replied, managing a weak smile. In the field hospitals, the bravest soldiers would faint at the sound of a woman in labor. Her words were cut short as another contraction seized her, more powerful than any before. This one was different, a tremendous pressure building, an overwhelming urge to push. It's time, she gasped when she could speak again. The baby's coming now. Clara's eyes widened, but she nodded resolutely. Tell me what to do. Help me sit up more, Abigail directed, struggling to find a better position on the narrow cot. I need to be able to bear down. Clara arranged the meager bedding to support Abigail's back, then knelt at the foot of the cot, her face pale but determined. I can see the head, she reported after a moment, awe in her voice. There's hair, dark like Matthew's. Emotion welled in Abigail's throat at the mention of her husband. How he had wanted this child. How he had talked to her belly in the evenings, telling stories of the adventures they would have together. Another contraction built the pressure, becoming unbearable. I need to push, Abigail gasped, gripping the edges of the cot. Push then, Clara encouraged. Push with the pain. Abigail bore down with all her strength, a primal sound escaping her lips despite her efforts to remain quiet. The pressure increased, then suddenly eased as the baby's head emerged. The head is out, Clara exclaimed. What now? Check if the cord is around the neck. Abigail panted, knowing this crucial moment could determine life or death. Clara's hands moved carefully. No cord. Everything looks normal. With the next contraction, the shoulders will come, Abigail instructed. Support the head, but don't pull. Let the baby turn naturally. She barely finished speaking before the next wave hit. Gathering her remaining strength, Abigail pushed again, feeling the incredible sensation of her child slipping from her body into the world. A moment of silence, then a lusty, indignant cry filled the small cabin. A boy, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face as she cradled the tiny red-faced infant. Abigail, you have a son. The door burst open as David rushed in, alarmed by the cry. He stopped short at the sight before him. Clara holding the newborn Abigail, exhausted but radiant, on the cot. A boy, he repeated softly, a smile breaking across his weathered features. Praise God. Clara looked to Abigail for further instructions, her hands steady but her expression uncertain. Tie off the cord, Abigail said, her voice weak but clear. There's string in my medical bag. Tie it in 2 places, about 2 inches apart, then cut between them. Clara complied, her movements careful and precise. Once the cord was cut, she wrapped the squalling infant in the cleanest fabric they had, one of Abigail's own petticoats, and placed him in his mother's waiting arms. Looking down at her son's face for the first time, Abigail felt a wave of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. He had Matthew's dark hair, her own determined chin, and a pair of lungs that suggested he'd inherited both their stubborn natures. Hello, little one, she whispered, tracing a finger over his perfect tiny features. You've chosen quite a time to join us. The baby quieted at the sound of her voice, his unfocused eyes seeming to search for her face. Something fundamental shifted within Abigail in that moment. A fierce protective love that transcended fear, pain, even her grief for Matthew. This child was her future, her purpose. Everything else, even justice for Matthew and the JKS victims, suddenly existed in relation to this new life she held. Clara moved efficiently around them, cleaning up as best she could, while David brought more water and added wood to the stove. The atmosphere into the small shack had transformed, no longer tense with anticipation, but filled with a quiet wonder. What will you name him? Clara asked softly, settling beside Abigail on the edge of the cot. Abigail gazed down at her son, who had fallen asleep against her chest. Matthew, she said without hesitation. Matthew William Hayes. For his father, Clara nodded approvingly. And William, my father's name, Abigail explained. A good name, a strong name. David cleared his throat from the doorway. I hate to intrude on this moment, he said apologetically, but we need to discuss our next steps. Dawn is only a few hours away, and Martha's trial is set for morning. Reality intruded harshly on the peaceful scene. Abigail tightened her hold on her son's maternal instinct, warring with the knowledge that they had unfinished business. I can't travel, she acknowledged. Not for at least a day, preferably longer. We can't leave you alone, Clara protested. You must, Abigail countered firmly. Martha needs that evidence. Those women at the mission need help. Matthew and I will be safe here for now. David and Clara exchanged troubled glances, clearly torn between protecting Abigail and her newborn and fulfilling their mission. What if Cooper or his men track us here? David asked, giving voice to the fear they all shared. They're focused on the mission right now, Abigail reasoned. And they expect us to be heading toward town to help Martha, not hiding in an abandoned line shack. She shifted the sleeping baby to one arm, reaching for Matthew's journal and the ledger page with the other. Take these. Get them to John Henderson and anyone else you can trust. Show them what JKS is doing and who's involved. Clara accepted the documents reluctantly. And if we're caught, then destroy the papers rather than let them fall into JKS hands, Abigail said grimly. But don't get caught. David moved to the small window, peering out at the night sky. We should leave within the hour if we're going to reach the mine by dawn. Henderson and his men will be waiting. Clara still looked unconvinced. I don't like leaving you. I don't like it either, Abigail admitted. But I've delivered enough babies to know that moving too soon after birth can be dangerous. And little Matthew needs warmth and quiet, not a desperate ride through the night. She reached out, gripping Clara's hand firmly. You can do this. You've survived worse than a nighttime ride. And those women at the mission, they need someone who understands what they're going through. Someone like you. Something shifted in Clara's expression, uncertainty giving way to resolve. I'll come back for you, she promised, as soon as it's safe. I know you will. David stepped outside to prepare the horses, while Clara gathered the few supplies they could spare. Enough water and food to last Abigail at least a day, the remaining bandages, and Martha's rifle. Keep this, she insisted, placing the weapon within easy reach of the cot. Just in case. Abigail nodded, knowing argument would be futile. Be careful, she said as Clara prepared to depart. Both of you. Clara paused at the door, looking back at mother and child with an expression Abigail couldn't quite decipher, something between longing and determination. We'll succeed, she said quietly. For Matthew, for your son, for all of us. Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Abigail listened to the muted sounds of their departure, hushed voices, the soft nickering of horses, the gradual fade of hoofbeats into the distance. Then silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the stove and her son's gentle breathing. Well, little one, she whispered to the sleeping infant, it's just you and me now. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, moving inexorably toward dawn, toward whatever the new day would bring. Clara had never considered herself particularly brave. Survival in her experience wasn't about courage, but endurance. The grim determination to take one more breath, endure one more day, find one more reason not to surrender to despair. But as she rode beside David through the pre-dawn darkness, Matthew's journal secure against her chest, she felt something that might have been bravery stirring within her. Or perhaps it was simply purpose, the knowledge that for the first time since her capture, her actions might have meaning beyond her own survival. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, as they made their way toward the Pearson mine, where John Henderson and his men would be waiting. The night had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east, the first hint that dawn approached. We should reach the mine within the hour, David said, eventually his voice low. Father will have gathered everyone he trusts. Clara nodded, her thoughts drifting to Abigail and her newborn son alone in the line shack. Do you think they'll be safe? The shack is well hidden, David assured her, and Cooper's men will be focused on the mission and the town preparing for Martha's trial. And us, Clara added grimly. They'll be looking for us. David didn't argue the point, which is why we need to move quickly. Get the evidence to my father, organize whatever men he's gathered, and make our move before Cooper realizes we know about the mission. The plan they discussed was straightforward but dangerous. John Henderson and his men would create a diversion at the mission's main gate while David, Clara, and a few others entered through the cemetery wall to free the captive women. Meanwhile, someone would need to get the ledger page and other evidence to the territorial marshal in Tucson, the nearest law enforcement not under Cooper or Hollister's influence. Simple in theory. Far more complicated in execution, especially with their small numbers against JKS's armed guards. What if there aren't enough men? Clara voiced a concern that had been nagging at her. What if your father couldn't gather enough people willing to stand against the sheriff and judge? David's expression hardened. Then we find another way. But we don't give up. His determination reminded Clara of Matthew, the same unwavering resolve, the same refusal to look away from injustice. Perhaps that was why she'd agreed to this desperate plan, why she was riding toward danger rather than away from it. Matthew had given his life trying to help a woman like her. She couldn't do less. The terrain grew more rugged as they approached the foothills where the abandoned Pearson mine was located. David led them up a narrow trail barely visible in the growing light that wound between towering rock formations. Almost there, he murmured, scanning the path ahead with alert eyes. The mine entrance is just beyond that ridge. Clara nodded, fighting exhaustion after the long night. The events at the line shack, Abigail's labor, the birth, the wonder and terror of helping bring a new life into the world, had drained what little reserve she'd built during her recovery. As they crested the ridge, the mine entrance came into view, a dark opening in the hillside partially obscured by scrub brush that had grown up around it. More importantly, horses were tethered nearby, at least 8 by Clara's quick count. They came, she breathed relief washing over her. David nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. Father keeps his word. They approached cautiously, nonetheless, David whistling a distinctive pattern as they drew near. A moment later, a figure emerged from the mine entrance. John Henderson, rifle in hand, his expression lightening at the sight of his son. David, he called softly. We were getting worried. More men appeared behind him, emerging from the shadows of the mine, ranchers, cowhands, a few shopkeepers Clara vaguely recognized from town. None wore badges or uniforms, but all carried weapons and wore expressions of grim determination. Where's Mrs. Hayes? Henderson asked as they dismounted. She had her baby, David explained quickly. A boy. They're safe at the line shack near Copper Creek. Murmurs of surprise and concern rippled through the gathered men. Henderson's brow furrowed with worry. She sent us on, Clara added, stepping forward with the journal and ledger page. Said this evidence was too important to delay. Henderson accepted the documents, examining them briefly before looking up with renewed resolve. She's right. We found more men willing to stand with us than I'd hoped. 17 altogether. Clara's heart lifted at the number. 17 armed men against JKS's guards. Better odds than they'd dared hope for. Any word from town? David asked. About Martha, Henderson's expression darkened. Trial's set for 9 this morning. Hollister arrived yesterday evening, took over the courthouse. There's talk he brought his own men with him, deputized them special for the occasion. He's at the mission, Clara informed him, or was last night, meeting with Cooper and another man we couldn't identify. This news caused another stir among the men. Henderson silenced them with a raised hand. Let's take this in, he suggested, gesturing toward the mine entrance. We have plans to discuss, and dawn's approaching fast. The abandoned mine proved larger than Clara had expected. The main tunnel extended about 30 feet into the hillside before opening into a wider chamber where miners had once sorted ore. Lanterns had been lit, casting long shadows across rough-hewn walls. A makeshift table had been constructed from planks laid across barrels, covered with what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the mission and surrounding area. Henderson introduced the gathered men briefly. Ranchers like himself, shopkeepers tired of Cooper's corruption, a few young cowboys eager for action. All had personal reasons for joining the fight against JKS. Missing daughters, sisters, sweethearts. Businesses extorted for protection. Land seized through dubious legal proceedings overseen by Judge Hollister. JKS has touched all our lives in some way, Henderson concluded grimly. Today, we end it. He spread Matthew's journal and the ledger page on the makeshift table, allowing the men to see for themselves the evidence of corruption and human trafficking. Expressions hardened as they read names they recognized. Respected businessmen, wealthy ranchers, even local politicians. Judge Hollister himself, one man spat, jabbing a finger at a particularly damning entry, paid $500 for a Spanish package last spring. And Cooper's been protecting the whole operation. Another added, examining the careful notes in Matthew's journal, taking a cut of every sale. Henderson let them absorb the evidence before calling for attention. Martha Carson's trial begins at 9. That gives us 3 hours to free the women at the mission and gather enough evidence to stop the trial and expose JKS. 3 hours isn't much time, someone observed. It's all we have, Henderson replied firmly. If Martha is convicted, it sends a message that no one can stand against the JKS and survive. We can't let that happen. He turned to the map outlining their plan of attack. 2 groups would approach the mission. The larger force under Henderson's command would create a diversion at the main gate, while a smaller team led by David would enter through the cemetery wall to locate and free the captive women. What about Cooper and Hollister? Clara asked. If they escape, they'll deny everything, claim the evidence is forged. Henderson nodded grimly. That's why I'm sending Tyler and his son to Tucson with copies of these documents. The territorial marshal is an honest man not in JKS's pocket. He'll bring proper authorities. That could take days, David pointed out, which is why we need living witnesses. Henderson replied, his gaze settling on Clara. Women who can testify to what JKS has done. Your testimony alone would be powerful, Miss Bishop, but a dozen voices. That's something even Hollister can't silence. Clara felt the weight of expectations settle upon her shoulders. The prospect of speaking publicly about her ordeal of facing her captors in court sent a tremor of fear through her. But beneath the fear was something stronger, the same determination she'd seen in Abigail's eyes. I'll testify, she said firmly, and I'll help the others find the courage to do the same. Henderson nodded approvingly before continuing with the final details of their plan. Maps were studied, assignments given, weapons checked and loaded. As the men prepared, Clara found herself drawing David aside. There's something we haven't discussed, she said quietly. What if we're too late? What if Martha's trial has already started by the time we free the women? David's expression grew troubled. Then someone needs to stop the proceedings. Buy time until we can bring our evidence and witnesses. I could go, Clara offered, to the courthouse. I know JKS better than anyone here. My testimony alone might be enough to create doubt, delay the verdict. It's too dangerous, David protested. If Cooper or Hollister recognize you, they won't, Clara interrupted. They never saw my face. The men who took me, who branded me, they're likely at the mission, not the courthouse. David still looked unconvinced. You'd be walking into a room controlled by JKS supporters. If something went wrong, it's no more dangerous than what you're planning at the mission, Clara pointed out. And if it saves Martha, she left the sentence unfinished, but its implication hung between them. Martha had risked everything to help them. They couldn't abandon her now. After a long moment, David nodded reluctantly. I'll speak to my father, but you won't go alone. We'll find someone to accompany you, someone Cooper won't recognize. As he moved away to consult with Henderson, Clara found herself thinking of Rebecca, the young woman who had sung to comfort the other captives, of Emma Matthews' sister, who had never reached her destination, of all the women whose names she didn't know but whose suffering she shared. Today, one way or another, they would have justice. The line shack was quiet save for the soft sounds of the baby nursing at Abigail's breast. Morning light filtered through the single window, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Beyond the walls, birds called to one another, their cheerful notes, a stark contrast to the tension Abigail felt. Little Matthew had proven himself a determined soul from his first moments, nursing vigorously, crying lustily when displeased, falling into deep, peaceful sleep when satisfied. So like his father in his intensity, his unwillingness to do anything by half measures. Your timing could have been better, Abigail murmured to him fondly, stroking the dark wisps of hair on his head. But I suppose you come by your impatience honestly. The baby continued nursing, oblivious to his mother's concerns. Abigail shifted slightly on the cot, wincing at the soreness that pervaded her body. The birth had been straightforward as such things went. No complications beyond the less-than-ideal setting, but her body still ached from the ordeal. Outside, the sun continued its climb into the morning sky. By now, Clara and David would have reached the mine met with John Henderson and whoever else had answered the call. Perhaps they were already making their way to the mission or to town where Martha's trial would soon begin. And here she sat useless to them, bound by the limitations of her recovering body and the needs of her newborn son. "I should be there," she whispered, frustration coloring her voice. "I should be helping them." The baby detached from her breast, satiated for the moment. Abigail raised him to her shoulder, patting his back gently, as she'd seen countless mothers do. Her medical training had prepared her for the physical aspects of childbirth and infant care, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional reality. The fierce, overwhelming love that made her heart ache, the terror at the thought of anything happening to this tiny being in her arms. Is this how Martha felt about Rose, she wondered? This desperate need to protect, to shelter, to fight if necessary. The sound of Matthew's tiny burp brought a smile to her lips, despite her worries. She cradled him in her arms, marveling at his perfect features, the way his hands curled into tiny fists, the alert darkness of his eyes when they occasionally opened. "Your father would have adored you," she told him softly. "He would have taught you to fish, to ride, to be a good man. But I promise you this, I will tell you about him every day, about his courage, his kindness, his refusal to look away when others suffered." The baby's eyes drifted close, sleep claiming him once more. Abigail continued to hold him, drawing comfort from his warmth and weight in her arms. The peaceful moment was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Abigail tensed her arms, tightening instinctively around her son. The rifle Clara had left leaned against the wall beside the cot, within reach, but not immediately at hand. Carefully trying not to disturb the sleeping infant, she shifted to place him on the cot before reaching for the weapon. The hoofbeats grew louder, approaching rather than passing by. One rider, from the sound of it, moving at a steady pace rather than a gallop. Not Clara or David returning with news then. They would have ridden harder, more urgently. Abigail checked that the rifle was loaded, then positioned herself beside the window, angling her body to see out while remaining partially concealed. The baby stirred, but didn't wake, his breathing remaining deep and even. The rider came into view, a woman on a dun mare, her figure slight, her clothing dust-covered from the trail. As she drew nearer, Abigail's grip on the rifle loosened in shock. It was Martha Carson. Abigail moved to the door, opening it just as Martha dismounted stiffly before the shack. The older woman's face was drawn with exhaustion, a livid bruise marking one cheekbone, but her eyes were clear and determined as ever. "Martha," Abigail exclaimed, leaning against the doorframe for support. "How—" "No time for explanations," Martha interrupted, her voice hoarse. "Cooper's men are coming. They know you're here." Cold fear washed over Abigail. How could they know? "Tortured it out of one of Henderson's men they captured on the road," Martha said grimly, pushing past Abigail into the shack. Her eyes widened at the sight of the newborn on the cot. "So it's true. You had the baby." "Last night," Abigail confirmed, closing the door and moving back to her son. "A boy, Matthew William." Something softened in Martha's weathered features. "He's beautiful," she said simply. Then with visible effort, she returned to the urgent matter at hand. "We need to leave, now." "I can't," Abigail protested. "It's too soon after the birth, and the baby will die alongside you if Cooper finds you here," Martha finished bluntly. "They're not taking prisoners anymore, Abigail. They're eliminating witnesses." The starkness of her words left no room for argument. Abigail looked down at her sleeping son, then back at Martha. "How did you escape the trial?" "Never happened," Martha said, moving around the small shack with surprising energy, gathering what few supplies remained. "Henderson and his men created enough of a distraction in town that I was able to get away in the confusion. But Cooper figured out it was a diversion. He sent men to the mission and others to find you. Clara and David were headed to the mission last I heard," Martha reported. "Henderson's son told me where to find you before he joined the others." Abigail processed this information quickly. "So the attack on the mission is happening now?" Martha nodded grimly. "And we need to be far from here when Cooper's men arrive. Can you ride?" The very thought sent pain shooting through Abigail's still tender body, but she nodded. "If the alternative is staying here to be killed, yes." "Good girl." Martha approved, her tone softening slightly. "We'll go slow, take the back trails. I know a place they won't look for us." Abigail rose carefully, cradling her son close as she gathered what she would need. Clean cloths for the baby, her medical bag, a blanket to wrap around them both. Martha took the rifle, checking it with the ease of long familiarity before slinging it over her shoulder. "How far?" Abigail asked, dreading the answer. "About 5 miles," Martha replied. "An old trapper's cabin in the high country, remote, defensible if needed." 5 miles. It might as well have been 50 in Abigail's current condition. But Martha was right. Staying meant certain death for her and her son. She straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Let's go then." Outside, Martha helped her mount the dun mare, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate Abigail's weakened state. The baby, disturbed by the movement, began to fuss softly. "Shh, little one," Abigail soothed, holding him securely against her chest with one arm while gripping the saddle horn with the other. "We need to be very quiet now." Martha mounted behind her, her arms reaching around to take the reins. "I'll guide the horse," she said quietly. "You focus on holding the baby." They set off at a walking pace, Martha steering them immediately away from the main trail and into a stand of junipers that offered concealment. The motion of the horse sent waves of discomfort through Abigail's body, but she bit her lip and endured, concentrating on keeping her son secure and quiet. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked after they'd traveled some distance in silence. "David told his father, who told me when they broke me out of the jail." Martha explained, her voice low. "Said you'd had the baby and couldn't be moved. Fool boy should have known Cooper would get the information somehow." There was no real condemnation in her tone, just the pragmatic assessment of someone who had survived decades on the frontier by anticipating the worst. "What happened at the courthouse?" Abigail pressed. "You said there was no trial." Martha's short laugh held no humor. "Hollister never intended a trial, just a hanging. Had the gallows built behind the courthouse overnight." She touched the bruise on her cheek gingerly. "Made the mistake of telling him so to his face. Hence this little memento." Abigail's blood ran cold at the casual mention of a hanging. "They would have executed you without even the pretense of a trial." "JKS has abandoned pretense," Martha replied grimly. "Too many people asking questions, too many families looking for missing women. They're cutting their losses, eliminating anyone who knows too much." Including Matthew, Abigail thought. Including us. They continued in silence for a time, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats of the mare and the occasional soft noise from the baby. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying as morning gave way to midday. "How much further?" Abigail asked, eventually, exhaustion evident in her voice. "Another mile or so," Martha assured her. "You're doing well, both of you." The praise, simple as it was, bolstered Abigail's flagging strength. She focused on the path ahead, on the steady rise and fall of her son's chest against hers, on putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the line shack. They had just begun to ascend a steeper trail that wound into more densely forested foothills when Martha suddenly reined in the horse, her body tensing behind Abigail. "What is it?" Abigail whispered, instantly alert despite her fatigue. "Riders," Martha murmured, turning the horse off the trail and into a thicket of scrub oak. "Coming down from above." They waited in tense silence, Martha's hand hovering near the rifle slung across her back. The baby stirred against Abigail's chest, but remained mercifully quiet, as if sensing the danger. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, 3 or 4 riders descending the same trail they had been about to climb. Abigail held her breath as the riders came into view through the screen of vegetation. Cooper's deputies, armed and alert, their expressions grim as they scanned the terrain around them. One man, younger than the others, with a shock of red hair visible beneath his hat, held a piece of paper, consulting it as they rode. "Map says the trapper's cabin is just over this ridge," he called to the others. "Cooper wants it checked and secured before nightfall." "Waste of time," another deputy grumbled. "No one's used that cabin in years." "Orders are orders," the first man replied. "We check every possible hiding place. The woman and her brat can't have gotten far." Abigail felt Martha tense further behind her, the older woman's hand now resting on the rifle. But attacking 4 armed men would be suicide, and they both knew it. They remained motionless as the deputies continued down the trail, passing within 30 yards of their hiding place. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance did Martha exhale slowly. "They're headed for the cabin I was taking you to," she whispered. "Cooper's thorough, I'll give him that." "Where do we go now?" Abigail asked, desperation edging her voice. Her body was beginning to protest in earnest pain radiating from places she hadn't known could hurt. Martha was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing their limited options. "There's one place they might not think to look," she said finally. "The mission." "The mission," Abigail repeated incredulously. "But that's JKS headquarters. And if Henderson and the others are attacking—" "Exactly," Martha interrupted. "It's the last place Cooper would expect us to go. And if Henderson's men have succeeded, it will be the safest place for miles. And if they've failed—" Martha's silence was answer enough. If Henderson's attack had failed, nowhere would be truly safe for them. But the mission offered at least the possibility of allies, of medical care for Abigail, of shelter for the infant. "How far?" Abigail asked, resignation in her voice. "About 3 miles cross-country," Martha replied. "We can be there by mid-afternoon if we push on." 3 more miles. Abigail wasn't certain her body could endure it, but what choice did they have? She nodded wearily, adjusting her hold on the now-sleeping baby. "Let's go." Martha guided the horse back to the trail, then immediately off it again on the opposite side, choosing a route that would take them cross-country toward the mission while avoiding the main paths where Cooper's men might be patrolling. The journey was arduous. The terrain grew increasingly rocky and steep, forcing them to dismount in places and lead the horse on foot. Abigail moved like one in a dream, pain and exhaustion blurring the edges of her consciousness. Only the precious weight of her son in her arms kept her putting one foot in front of the other. The sun had begun its westward descent when they finally crested a rise that offered a view of the mission in the distance. Martha raised a hand to shield her eyes, studying the scene intently. "No smoke," she observed. "No movement that I can see." "What does that mean?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could mean anything," Martha admitted. "We'll approach carefully. If there's any sign of Cooper's men, we'll pull back." They continued their cautious approach, using every bit of available cover. As they drew nearer, details became clearer. The main gate standing open, several horses tethered in the courtyard, no guards visible on the walls. "Doesn't look like an active JKS operation anymore," Martha murmured. "But I don't see Henderson's men either." They paused at the edge of the open ground that surrounded the mission, concealed by a stand of mesquite. The baby had begun to fuss softly, hungry after the long journey. "I need to feed him soon," Abigail said, bouncing him gently in an attempt to soothe him. "And I can't go much further, Martha." The older woman nodded grimly. "Wait here with the horse," she decided, unslinging the rifle. "I'll scout ahead, see if it's safe." Before Abigail could protest, Martha was gone, moving with surprising stealth for a woman of her years. Abigail watched anxiously as she approached the mission walls, keeping to the shadows, the rifle held ready. Minutes stretched interminably. The baby's fussing increased, his tiny face screwing up in preparation for a full-throated cry. Abigail rocked him desperately, knowing that any noise might attract unwanted attention. "Just a little longer, sweetheart," she pleaded softly. "Just a little quiet for Mama." As if understanding, the baby subsided into whimpers rather than outright cries. Abigail continued rocking him, her eyes never leaving the mission walls where Martha had disappeared. Finally, a figure appeared at the main gate, Martha without the rifle waving for Abigail to approach. The gesture was unhurried, almost casual, suggesting no immediate danger. With trembling legs, Abigail led the horse across the open ground toward the mission. As she drew closer, she saw other figures emerging from the gate, women, some supporting others who appeared injured or weakened. And among them, her face dirty, but her eyes shining with triumph, was Clara. "Abigail," she called, rushing forward to help her, the last few yards to the gate. "What are you doing here? You should be resting." "Cooper's men," Abigail explained wearily, allowing Clara to take the baby while Martha helped her dismount. "They were coming for us at the line shack." Martha said this was the only place they wouldn't look. Clara cradled little Matthew with surprising confidence, her expression softening as she looked down at him. "Smart thinking. Cooper and his men are all either dead, captured, or fled." "Henderson's attack succeeded then?" Martha asked, taking Abigail's arm to support her as they entered the mission courtyard. Clara nodded, a shadow crossing her features. "At a cost. We lost 4 men, including Tyler. But we freed 23 women and girls and captured evidence that will destroy JKS completely." Inside the courtyard, Abigail saw the aftermath of battle. Bloodstains on the dusty ground, makeshift bandaging stations where the wounded were being tended, women of various ages huddled in groups, many looking shell-shocked and uncertain. Where's David? Martha asked, scanning the courtyard. And John? John is organizing the return to town, Clara replied. David, she hesitated. David was wounded, not severely, she added quickly, seeing the alarm on their faces. He's resting in what used to be the priest's quarters. She led them across the courtyard to a small stone building attached to the main church. Inside, David Henderson lay on a narrow cot, his shoulder bandaged, his face pale, but his eyes clear as he looked up at their entrance. Mrs. Hayes, he said, surprise evident in his voice. You shouldn't be here. So I've been told, Abigail replied dryly, sinking gratefully onto a chair beside his cot. But circumstances didn't leave us many options. While Martha checked David's wound with motherly concern, Clara continued to hold the baby, rocking him gently as his fussing increased. He's hungry, Abigail explained apologetically. I need to feed him. Of course, Clara said carefully, returning the infant to his mother's arms. I'll give you privacy. As Clara turned to leave, Abigail caught her hand. Wait, tell me what happened. The attack, Martha's rescue, all of it. Clara hesitated, glancing at David, who nodded encouragingly. You should know, he agreed. You're as much a part of this as any of us. Clara settled on a wooden stool as Abigail arranged herself to nurse the now crying infant. Once he was latched and nursing contentedly, Clara began her account. The attack on the mission had gone largely according to plan. Henderson's men had created a diversion at the main gate, while David led a smaller group through the cemetery wall. The JKS guards, fewer in number than expected, had been overwhelmed relatively quickly. Most of their men were in town for Martha's trial, Clara explained. They left only a skeleton crew here with the women. Judge Hollister and the unidentified third man had departed the previous evening, leaving Cooper to oversee operations. But the sheriff had also gone to town by dawn, anticipating Martha's execution. We found ledgers, correspondence, even contracts for the sale of women, Clara continued. Names, dates, amounts paid. Everything Matthew had been gathering evidence of, but more comprehensive than he could have imagined. And the women, Abigail asked softly, looking down at her nursing son. Some were held for months, like I was, Clara replied, her voice tightening. Others only days or weeks. A few were scheduled for shipment to California tomorrow. Martha rejoined them, having finished examining David's wound. And my trial, what happened there? Clara exchanged a glance with David before answering. I went to the courthouse while the others attacked the mission, she said. Thought I might be able to disrupt the proceedings by time. She described arriving to find not a trial but an execution in preparation. Hollister presiding with Cooper and several deputies flanking him, a hastily constructed gallows behind the courthouse. I didn't know what to do, Claire admitted. There were too many armed men. But then Henderson's diversion started. Men firing into the air at the edge of town, shouting about an attack at the mission. In the ensuing chaos with Cooper and most of his men rushing to respond to the reported attack, John Henderson and a few trusted allies had entered the courthouse from the rear, overwhelmed the remaining guards, and freed Martha. Hollister escaped in the confusion, Clara concluded grimly. But Cooper didn't make it back to the mission in time. He was captured by Henderson's men on the road. He's under guard in the church now. And the third man, Abigail asked? The one you couldn't identify. Gone, David replied from his cot. But we know who he is now. Victor Hollister, the judge's son. The name meant nothing to Abigail, but Clara's sharp intake of breath suggested it held significance. Victor Hollister is one of the wealthiest men in San Francisco, she explained. He owns shipping companies, banks, even a railroad. And apparently he's been the financial backer of JKS from the beginning. His ships would be perfect for moving captives to markets overseas, Martha observed grimly. Abigail looked down at her son, now drowsing at her breast, blissfully unaware of the evil they discussed. An overwhelming wave of gratitude washed over her. Gratitude that he would grow up in a world where JKS no longer operated, where justice might actually prevail. What happens now? She asked gently, detaching the sleeping infant and adjusting her clothing. The territorial marshal is on his way from Tucson, Claire replied. Should arrive by tomorrow morning. He'll take custody of Cooper and the evidence, organize proper care for the women. And Hollister, his son, Martha pressed. Warrants will be issued, David said confidently. They won't escape justice, not with the evidence we've gathered. Abigail wanted to believe him, but experience had taught her that powerful men often evaded the consequences of their actions. Still looking at the determined faces around her, she felt a cautious hope. Matthew's work, his sacrifice, had not been in vain. You should rest, Clara said, noticing Abigail's drooping eyelids. Both of you have had a long day. Abigail didn't argue. Exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight, the events of the past 24 hours catching up all at once. Clara helped her to a small, adjacent room where a clean pallet had been prepared, likely for one of the wounded. I'll watch over little Matthew while you sleep. She offered, her eyes soft as she gazed at the infant. If he gets hungry, I'll wake you. Too tired to protest, Abigail carefully transferred her sleeping son to Clara's arms. Thank you, she murmured, for everything. Clara smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face, erasing for a moment the shadows of her captivity. Rest now. You're safe. We all are. As Abigail settled onto the pallet, her body's aches making themselves known in earnest, she found herself thinking of Matthew. Not her son, but her husband. Would he be proud of what they'd accomplished? Of the risks they'd taken, the justice they'd sought? She thought he would be. More than that, she thought he would recognize in Clara, in Martha, in all of them, the same courage he had shown in standing against evil. Sleep claimed her before she could pursue the thought further, carrying her into dreams where Matthew smiled at her across a sunlit meadow. Their son, between them, the shadows of the past finally giving way to light. Dawn broke over Mission San Xavier, painting the ancient stone walls in hues of gold and rose. Abigail stood on the ramparts, her son cradled in her arms, watching as the new day emerged from darkness. Below in the courtyard, preparations were underway for the journey to town. The freed women, some reunited with family members who had arrived during the night, others still alone, but supporting one another, gathered their few possessions. Henderson's men checked weapons, saddled horses, organized wagons for those too weak to ride. It's really over, isn't it? Clara asked softly, joining Abigail at the wall. Her face was freshly washed, her hair neatly braided, though the JKS brand on her wrist remained visible, a permanent reminder of what she had endured. This part is, Abigail replied, shifting little Matthew to her shoulder. There will be trials, testimonies. Hollister and his son may yet escape justice if their money and influence are enough. But JKS is finished, Clara insisted. Their operation here is destroyed. The women are free. That counts for something. Abigail nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. It counts for everything to those women. To you. They stood in companionable silence, watching the activity below. Martha had taken charge of organizing supplies for the journey, her capable hands, in no-nonsense manner, bringing order to potential chaos. David, his arm in a sling, but otherwise recovering well, assisted his father in planning their route back to town. What will you do now? Abigail asked eventually. After the trials, I mean. Clara considered the question thoughtfully. I'm not sure. I can't go back to who I was before. That girl died somewhere along the way. But you survived, Abigail pointed out gently. You're here helping others who shared your experience. That's not nothing. No, Clara agreed, a small smile touching her lips. It's not nothing. And she hesitated before continuing. I've been thinking, Martha mentioned she could use help with her ranch. Someone younger to manage the daily work while she focuses on the cattle business. You'd stay in the territory? Abigail asked, surprised. After everything that happened here, Clara's gaze remained on the horizon where the sun continued its ascent into the morning sky. This is where I found my strength, she said simply, where I learned I could fight back. I'm not ready to leave that behind. Abigail understood. Despite the pain and loss she'd experienced in Arizona, she too felt reluctant to leave. This harsh, beautiful land had shaped her in ways she was only beginning to understand. And you, Clara asked, will you stay at your ranch, raise little Matthew there? The question gave Abigail pause. She had been so focused on surviving, on bringing JKS to justice, that she hadn't given much thought to the future beyond the immediate crisis. I think so, she said slowly. It's where his father's memory lives, where we were happy, however briefly. She looked down at her son, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. But I'll need help, a woman alone with an infant on a ranch. You won't be alone, Clara assured her. Martha has already declared herself honorary grandmother to that child, and I'll be nearby if you'll allow me to visit. Visit? Abigail echoed. Clara, you're welcome anytime, more than welcome. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bonding forged through danger and shared purpose. Not quite friendship, not quite family, but something equally strong. Mrs. Hayes, Miss Bishop. David's voice called from below. Marshall's riders have been spotted. We should prepare to move out. The moment broken, they descended from the ramparts to join the others in the courtyard. The territorial marshal would take formal custody of Cooper and the evidence ensuring proper legal proceedings against JKS and its members. As Abigail helped load the last of their supplies into a wagon, she would ride rather than walk a concession to her still recovering body. Martha approached, her weathered face serious. Just got word from town, she said, her voice pitched low for their ears only. Judge Hollister was found dead in his hotel room this morning. Gunshot to the head. Abigail's eyes widened in shock. Suicide. Martha's expression remained neutral. So they're saying. Left a note confessing his involvement with JKS, exonerating certain other parties. His son, Clara deduced immediately. He killed himself to protect Victor. Or was killed to silence him, Martha suggested grimly. Either way, the son is already on his way to California, according to the telegraph operator. Abigail absorbed this news with mixed emotions. Hollister's death meant justice of a sort, but it also potentially allowed his son, perhaps the true architect of JKS, to escape punishment. We still have Cooper, she said finally, and the ledgers, the contracts, the women's testimonies. It will be enough to destroy what remains of JKS, Martha agreed, if not to reach every person responsible. It wasn't perfect justice, Abigail reflected, but perhaps perfect justice was too much to expect in an imperfect world. What mattered was that JKS no longer operated in Arizona territory, that the women they had captured were free, that Matthew's death had not been in vain. The sound of approaching horsemen announced the marshal's arrival. Abigail wrapped her shawl more securely around her son, shielding him from the morning sun, as Clara helped her onto a gentle mare equipped with a side saddle. Ready? Clara asked, adjusting the stirrup length. Abigail looked around the mission courtyard, at the women preparing to return to their lives or build new ones, at Martha directing operations with calm efficiency, at the Henderson men conferring with the newly arrived lawmen. So much had changed in so little time. So much had been lost, and yet so much gained. Ready, she confirmed, her gaze returning to Clara's face. For whatever comes next. As they rode through the mission gates, Abigail carried with her not just her newborn son, but a sense of completion, of a circle closed. Matthew's work was finished. JKS was defeated. The women were free. And ahead lay a future she could not yet envision, but faced now with strength she hadn't known she possessed. Strength forged in grief, tempered by courage, and ultimately transformed into hope. The morning sun warmed her face as they rode toward town, toward justice, toward tomorrow. And for the first time since Matthew's death, Abigail Hayes felt not just the weight of survival, but the lightness of living. When dawn awakened, she thought, looking down at her sleeping son, so do we.